Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. And today is the day that I put together the last part of the canon presentation, and that is the canon of Scripture. Today in particular we're going to be going over the New Testament canon, which is of course what Christians typically get the most excited about because it's the revelation of Christ. It reveals what was done in the early church. It completes the salvation saga that has been happening from Old Testament times and brings it up to its moment of completion, and so it's very, very, very exciting stuff. And also within Christianity there's a great deal of unanimity on what the New Testament canon is. There's a couple groups that are different, and we'll talk about those, but for the most part most Christian groups accept the New Testament canon as it is. Now, even though it's pretty well set within Christian groups, even between traditional and non-traditional, between high church and low church Christians, like I said, for the most part, a couple groups that are a little different, but for the most part, very well accepted within Christianity. There are still objections and questions that are raised by atheists, agnostics, and people of other religions. And we want to treat those sorts of situations very seriously, and we want to make sure that we're giving them their due attention. And so here we're going to go through a lot like we did for the Old Testament and just kind of go through the different issues that are coming up. So like I did with the Old Testament discourse, I broke this down into four major sections. The first thing that we're going to talk about is why is there any confusion as to what the New Testament is in the first place? Why is it that when you look at the Christian history there are doubts regarding certain books at certain times, and they're not always unanimous? If this had just floated down from heaven, everyone would understand what it was and that it was there and everything would be perfect. What happened? Why was there confusion? And that's where a lot of people get hung up on, is this whole issue of, did the church know what the New Testament canon was, or didn't they? Was it something that they later on decided? Was it something, that was put together and people later forgot, or all this kind of stuff? There's lots of questions that get raised there, and so we want to do our best to answer those as accurately and forthrightly as possible. So we're going to talk about that. And I'll tell you right now, most of it just comes down to the historical circumstances of the day. It really doesn't have anything to do with conspiracy theories or secret meetings or people trying to leave stuff out or put stuff in. Most of it is very non-conspiratorial, very, very natural explanations for most of it. Then also, in the second part, we're going to get into the early church evidence. What exactly are the early church sources saying about the New Testament canon? So we're going to talk about some of the historical reasons surrounding some of the confusion that happened, and then what the early church fathers are actually saying. And then thirdly, we're going to get into something that is a little bit more controversial between Christian groups. Like I said, for the most part, the New Testament is pretty well set. They understand it, got it, pretty much a lot of agreement there, but one thing that is debatable is which particular New Testament text you're supposed to use. Most groups agree on the books, but the particular form of the text that you're supposed to use, primarily whether you use the Alexandrian or the Byzantine text type, or in other terms, the critical versus the majority text, these kinds of things. You guys may be familiar with those terms. We'll talk about some of the differences there. I don't have time to get into everything regarding the textual differences, but we'll go over some of the main ones and what the reasons are for the contention there. And then finally, we'll, just like we did for the Old Testament canon, we'll go over our New Testament standards of canonicity, and they're going to be very similar to the Old Testament standards. Evangelicals, and for those of you guys who know me and have listened to my other ones, I'm evangelical Pentecostal. I'm a member of the Assemblies of God, and so that's the point of view that I come at this from. But our standards are pretty uniform for both the Old Testament and the New Testament. We really didn't have to change a lot of things up. We kind of changed the titles a little bit, and particular points of reference get changed a little bit just because of the necessity of what you're dealing with. But the standards are actually very similar, and we'll see that. Alright, so let's go ahead and get into this. First, we're talking about the confusion. What happened to make it so that the early church fathers weren't always as sure as they could have been about which books were in the New Testament? Well, the first major source of confusion that you're going to have is just the relative geographic isolation of the time. That is, the Roman Empire for its time was basically the largest European empire. It wasn't the largest one on Earth at that time. I think that would go to Genghis Khan. But as far as European empires are concerned, Rome was it. It covered a very large span of territory, and at that time travel was relatively slow. So new Christian groups that were just recently founded usually didn't have much of an idea of what the New Testament books were, especially compared with the older, more established ones. And that's because a lot of times when a new Christian group was established, it wasn't like the person who was establishing just brought their Bible with them, because the Bible as a single compilation didn't exist at that time. Instead, you'd usually carry it as separate parchments or as separate scrolls. And considering that there's 27 books in the New Testament and scrolls are rather bulky and so are parchments, you probably wouldn't be carrying all of them with you. You'd be carrying enough to deliver the basic gospel to people and get them started, and over time they would be exposed to more and more writings. And so at different points in time, especially the fringe groups, as you would say, the ones that weren't established as early, they would still be accepting new books in for a while, just because they didn't all instantly come and travel was rather slow. And so that was a problem that you had in the establishment of the canon. You have to remember that the canonical books of the New Testament were originally dispersed. They were given to separate people. The Ephesians was, of course, as far as we can tell, written to the Ephesians, Philippians to the Philippians, Romans to the Romans. Now, eventually they started getting spread around as circulars. One church would pass it on to the next, and so on and so forth, but that takes time. And so we wouldn't expect an instant understanding by all churches everywhere of what the New Testament canon is. It just wouldn't have been practical at that time. So relative geographic isolation, both because of the size of the Roman Empire and due to the slow travel within the empire, is going to be one of the first and significant forces that's going to keep knowledge of the canon somewhat limited for a time. But this does raise an interesting question in Christianity. Even for us as evangelicals, we like to emphasize the Bible a lot, of course. It's a major tenet of faith. But a question that does come up is, how many books of the Bible do you have to know of in order to be a Christian? Is there any place in the Bible that says, thou must affirmest all 66 books? Is there any statement like that in the Bible? No, of course not. Being a Christian has nothing to do with accepting the Bible. It has everything to do with accepting Christ. As Christians, our faith is in Christ. It is not in the Bible. Now, the Bible is the record of Christ, in that it both predicts him, records him, and then comments on him thereafter. But it is not Christ. As Christians, we are not, our faith is not contingent upon having every single part of the Bible and understanding every single part, but rather it is on receiving the Word, on receiving the message, on receiving what Christ did on the cross for us. As Paul said, what I preach is Christ crucified. And to them that are being saved, the cross is the power, the might, the effectiveness of God. And that's what it means to be a Christian. Now, like I said, we still use the Bible, though it is still the standard of the faith, and that it is our primary source of information regarding Christ. But in order to accept him and in order to be a Christian in the basic sense, no, you don't need to have all 66 books. And that's no different now than it was then. There's lots of Christian groups all around the world who don't have complete Bibles. There are some groups that, due to the persecution in those areas, sometimes only have a page. Sometimes they only have a few verses here and there memorized, and they cherish them greatly. But we're certainly not going to call them less Christian due to the circumstances of their existence. And that actually leads into the second major cause for why knowledge of all of the canonical books of the New Testament was somewhat limited, and that is because of persecution. The Romans very frequently persecuted Christians. In many ways, there was a lot of martyrdom that happens, and most people know about that, but something that they don't realize is that the Romans realized fairly early on that martyrdom itself isn't going to be enough to keep this movement under control. Killing people works as a decent way of intimidating a lot of people, but it doesn't necessarily prevent the spread of a religion, because martyrdom also tends to pique people's interest. They say, well, if these people are being martyred, there must be some reason for it, and they get curious and they'll start inquiring about it. And so the Roman approach to dealing with the Christian problem was actually kind of two-pronged. There was killing Christians publicly as a deterrent, but that deterrent could become a bit of an invitation in that it piqued people's interest. And so to keep them from being able to inquire too much, the Romans also did a lot of book burnings. They burned a lot of Christian books. There's one such instance that's recorded in Metzger. He wrote a book called the New Testament Canon, or the Canon of the New Testament. And in it he records one raid that the Romans did on a local church, and demanded that the church leaders surrender their books. And the church leaders did so. For the most part, they were fairly compliant. They didn't cause unnecessary waves. And the thing about Christianity is Christianity can go on just fine without the book. You remember the message and you can spread the message. You don't really have to have the book, just so long as you remember the message of the book. But in this one particular instance, from just one church, they wound up confiscating over 30 manuscripts, which is quite a few, and most of the early church actually had access to quite a few. But the Romans did their best to try to keep it under wraps, and so if the books are getting burned, and you also have a lot of the Christian leaders getting martyred, it's going to result in a certain amount of confusion as to what is in there and what is not. Just like a lot of groups, Christian groups today, don't necessarily know what the whole Bible is composed of, because they only have fragments and parts, and the people who could teach them sometimes get killed by the powers that be. And so we don't necessarily expect that every single Christian group is going to know everything about this, and that's just because of the conditions that early Christianity experienced as being a part of the Roman Empire. Now, those weren't the only influences, though. Another great influence on early Christianity were the early heresies, and there's two main ones that I would say that most people really need to know. Perhaps every evangelical, in a sense, needs to know about. The first one a lot of evangelicals do know about, and that's Gnosticism. And if you don't know who the Gnostics are, this is a brief description of them. These were groups that said there is a secret knowledge that was taught by Christ. And there's lots of different parts to it. They usually viewed matter as being unreal and sort of accidental, that there were different gods between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament God is a God who messed up and got things wrong, and the New Testament God came to fix the problems, and things like that. And they, as far as the canon is concerned, they're most famous for their misuse of Paul. And they took a lot of what Paul said way out of context, because Paul talks about things like the mystery of God, mystery of the gospel, mystery of Christ. And in saying that, he basically means what has been revealed by God, but something that man in and of himself can't know. It is something that requires revelation, and that's what he means by mystery. But they took it as being mystery, as in there are these secret things that you Christians don't know, but we do know. And see, even Paul says so. Great misuse of Paul. And so there were Christians who reacted to this. And this is always something that happens in history. You have an action, and then you have a reaction. And sometimes those reactions push us out of what was there originally. In the case of the Gnostics and their use of Paul, you would have some Christian groups that decided to de-emphasize Paul because he was associated with heretics and they didn't like that. And then there were others who said, no, Paul's just fine, and they actually started over-emphasizing him, and particularly at the expense of the Catholic epistles. And so some of the early evidence that we have for the Bible doesn't include many references to the Catholic epistles, partially just because there's relatively few of them. And even in modern times, you won't hear a lot of people preach out of the Catholic epistles that often. And for those of you who don't know what the Catholic epistles are, they are the epistles that were basically written without a particular audience in mind. They weren't written to a specific place, but rather they were general. That's basically what Catholic meant. General, universal, universally applicable, generally disclosed. And so books like James and Jude, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, 1st and 2nd Peter, those are all called the Catholic epistles. Now, Gnosticism didn't completely die out. There were definitely periods where it was more popular and periods where it had almost completely vanished, but it actually still survives into the modern age. And a modern group that has a lot of Gnostic elements in it is Christian Science. That is, they believe in right thinking and the power of mind over matter and these kinds of things, and that's a very Gnostic tenet. And that's the thing you find about most of the early heresies. They didn't really die out, they just kind of morphed into new things. And so Gnosticism is one of the primary reasons why in the early records you don't find a whole lot of references to the Catholic epistles. You do find some. And we'll discuss that. But not as much as there could be, and it's mostly just because there's kind of this overemphasis of what happened with Paul, and sometimes a little bit of an underemphasis that happened with Paul as well. But that's mainly due to the Gnostics, and like I said, a modern group that corresponds to them pretty well is the Christian Science group. Another early heresy that you need to understand is Montanism. Now, Gnosticism started pretty early on, and you can see these kind of proto-Gnostic ideas even in the New Testament. For example, the epistles of John deal with them. Some of the things that Paul talks about deals with some of the Gnostic ideas that were coming about. And so Gnosticism is pretty early in the list of heresies. Montanism is a little bit later on. It's towards the mid to end of the 2nd century and is also still fairly strong in the 3rd century. And Montanism was something that was very well happened within the church. Gnosticism was usually viewed as something that was pretty far outside of the church most of the time. They were very distinct groups. Montanism, though, had a lot that was similar to Christianity, and they used the Christian books and a lot of this kind of stuff, but they also had some views that were very different than the Christians. And one of the big differences was the belief in a new prophecy. Montanists had their own prophet, and they said we believe in modern prophecy, and we believe that we're led by a modern prophet. And this modern prophet, because he is God's spokesman, he has the right to add books to Scripture and to redefine things. And one of the things that they redefined is communion, or the sacrament, or the Eucharist. There's lots of different names for it. But basically, the Lord's Supper, taking the bread and the cup. And they said, oh, it's just fine if you use water. It's just fine, if you used, leaven and bread and all these kinds of things. It's just fine. And of course, all these things that they were doing, the surrounding Christian groups reacted to very strongly, of course. The Christian groups said, the book of Jude says, that this salvation, the gospel, it was delivered once for all to the saints. In past times God spoke by the prophets, but in these last days we have the revelation of Christ, and that is what covers the time of the last days, using Hebrews. And they said, no, we don't believe in a modern prophet in that sense. And this is where sometimes the terms get a little bit confused. A lot of new Christian groups do believe in the prophecy in the sense that Christians can receive special revelation from God. They don't believe in the office of prophet in the sense that you're going to have one person who is leading everybody else, well, except for the Catholics. They really like their pope. But most Christian groups as a whole, and especially evangelical groups as a whole, don't buy that singular leader idea. That is, they believe that the law and the prophets were until the time of Christ, Luke 16, and then after that time were under the time of the gospel, not the time of the prophets. And that has been the historic understanding in Christianity. And also the Montanists, since they had this special understanding through their spokesman, through their prophet, not only were they adding books of scripture and changing some of the customs of the Christians, like communion, like the Eucharist, they also had special interpretations of particular books, and in particular Hebrews and Revelation. And because of that, because of the association with Montanism and all the strangeness that happened there, the Christian churches didn't esteem these books as highly as a result. They called them into question. The West especially questioned Hebrews, and in the East they questioned Revelation. Now, a modern group that corresponds to Montanism, and you could probably hear a lot of the similarities just in me describing it, but a modern group that is very similar is Mormonism. They also affirm that they have a modern prophet. They affirm that they have books which have been added to Scripture under the authority of these living prophets. They also have changed the Eucharist. They've changed communion, the sacrament, so that it includes water and leavened bread. And they also have very special interpretations of books. In fact, Joseph Smith, in a lot of ways, the founder of Mormonism, or at least the modern iteration of Mormonism, he basically, he put all these things in place, and he established his own scripture. He said that it was okay to change communion, and he actually even went so far as to produce his own translation of the Bible, the Joseph Smith translation. Some of them call it the inspired version. Some of them say it's a commentary on Scripture. Some of them say that it actually corrects Scripture. There's a little bit of difference on how they explain it sometimes, but the idea there is that the Bible has to be seen through the lens of what their church institution is saying and says. And that is basically the same thing that the Montanists did. And actually it was kind of interesting. I think it was around a month or so ago, I had a young Mormon gal sitting in my living room, and we were talking about some of these things. And in particular, she explained her view of the Eucharist, of communion, of the sacraments. And she said, we use water and regular bread, and we say, because it really doesn't matter what it's done with, just so long as it's done with the right heart. And I said, oh, so you guys are Montanists. And she kind of diverted the conversation and tried to go on to something else. And I said, you don't know what a Montanist is, do you? She looked at me and she admitted she had no clue. And so I just suggested, maybe you should study that out and see what's going on there. Because what you said right now, and the way you've described your religion, sounds pretty much exactly like Montanism. And it was rejected then. And you guys yourselves would not call yourselves Montanists. So what's with that? If these guys were wrong, but you have the same basic tenets as them, isn't that kind of the pot calling the kettle black? Yeah, she didn't really have an answer for that. But the main point for us when we're talking about the canon is that because of Montanism, Hebrews and Revelation were kind of de-elevated. Hebrews, the authorship of Hebrews was called into question. For Revelation, the authenticity, the authorship was also called into question. Was Revelation really written by John the Apostle? Was Hebrews really written by Paul? And this is where this whole debate comes from. It comes from the influence of Montanism. Alright, so, moving on. Another aspect that influenced early Christianity and caused some confusion was the teachers of early Christianity themselves. Some people redacted or filtered the New Testament books that were given to their congregations. A good example is Tatian. Tatian produced what is called the Diatessaron. It's basically a compilation of the four Gospels into one account. It takes the four and it blends it all into one. It leaves some parts out, kind of augments certain parts. And this is a redaction. This is a, we're going to produce an official record here that covers everything that we're going to teach. And so what was given to Tatian's congregations wasn't the Gospels as originally written. It was a redacted form. It was basically Tatian's view of how the Gospels fit together. And then also there was a certain amount of filtering that happened. That is, Tatian and some of the others who did this had a relatively low view of the Catholic epistles and Revelation, or simply didn't know them because they came from one of the more recently established Christian groups that didn't have all of the books yet. And so what was given to the congregations was something that was smaller. There were certain books that just simply weren't delivered to them. And so what happened as a result of that is now there are actually a couple of traditional Christian groups that actually have a New Testament that's different from everybody else. There is a Syriac church in particular that has only a 22-book canon instead of a 27-book canon, and they omit 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. They don't include any of those. And then there's others who paid a lot of attention to their specific teachers and to their specific leaders who basically added things, and most of them were things that had to do with church governance and operation of the church and things like that, but they included them in their New Testament. And so the Ethiopian church actually has a 35-book New Testament. They include 4 books of the Synodas. They include Clement, and it's not the same Clement that you see in other ones, First Clement, Second Clement. It's not that Clement, it's another guy named Clement. They include 2 books of the Covenant, and then they also include the Didascalia. And like I said, most of these are rules on church governance, basic ways of living a good moral life, and things like this. They're not necessarily things that anyone would necessarily say are untrue of Christians. It's just that they weren't originally part of the New Testament. They were added by the specific leaders in an effort to teach the people specifically how to live. And so those groups that came out of that redaction filtration set that was more in the East than it was in the West, they wound up with different books and different canons. So these are all the major reasons that we have for the confusion. You have Christianity as a part of the Roman Empire with just the geographic isolation that happens and the persecution that's happening that keeps particular groups from learning what all of the New Testament books are early on, so that it's going to take some time for all of the groups to get all of the books. You also have some early heresies that cast doubt on certain books, or that people react strongly against, and they start de-emphasizing other parts of the New Testament and calling certain books like Hebrews and Revelation into question. And then you also have particular Christian leaders that are going around and they're intentionally withholding or changing or adding things for particular congregations. And so those congregations that wind up as a result of it are, of course, quite confused. And so, yeah, there was a lot of things that happened like this. And this is a major understanding that you have to come to in Christianity, especially when it comes to this issue of these churches that have very different New Testament canons. And that is the responsibility we would put for that is on those leaders who misrepresented things. That is, just as Christ said, if you lead even one of these little ones astray, it would be better for you to have a millstone hung around your neck and thrown into the depths of the sea. That is, Christ, God in general, is not going to keep people from doing stupid things necessarily, and that he still gives us our free will. But he's still going to hold us accountable for what we do with that free will. Just as we would in any society that has a sense of law, would allow people the privilege of breaking the law, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to view it as breaking the law. You still have certain rights and privileges to act on your own just as a necessity of living. But if you abuse those rights and privileges, yeah, you're going to be held accountable for it. And we would say the same thing of these leaders that led these groups astray. Would we hold these particular groups responsible? Not necessarily. Now, when presented with the information and the truth. If they still refuse it, then yeah, that's on them. But in so much as it is done out of innocence and fidelity to God, and they're serving God and seeking after Him with all their heart, God is the one who tests the thoughts and the motives of the heart. He knows what's going on in a person's heart, and so that issue we leave to Him. But as far as the leaders are concerned, if you misrepresent something, yeah, that's on you, buddy. But in general, getting back to the point here about talking about the New Testament canon, there were some very realistic, non-conspiratorial reasons why there was some confusion in the early days regarding what was in the canon and what wasn't. So let's go ahead and talk about the early church evidence. Now, just like I did for the Old Testament, I went through the Hendrickson collection and I put together all the people who list it. But there was also a little bit of other information that I thought was important beside just the listers. In particular, First Clement was also important. I want to talk about that. But most of this comes from people who list the scripture in one way or another and talk specifically about what books are being used. Another source that I consulted was Metzger's book on the canon of the New Testament. And Metzger's book is a nice resource. He's a little liberal in some things he says, more so than I would be as a Pentecostal evangelical. Sometimes we can be pretty fundamentalist here in the Assemblies of God. And so he's a little bit more liberal than I would be. But at the same time, he tends to pretty much just present things as they were. And he doesn't offer a whole lot of interpretation to it, so he's relatively useful in that sense. And he also lists a lot of the same listers that I found in the Hendrickson collection, so I just consolidated them together. So let's get into it. Now, the first source I'd like to talk about is the Epistle of First Clement. First Clement was written in the 1st century, either in the 60s or the 90s. Scholars can't quite agree on that one, but the vast majority of them agree that it was something that was written in the 1st century. And First Clement doesn't go through and list the books. It doesn't talk about which books are used and which ones aren't or anything like that. Instead, it's just kind of a general... it's a letter actually to the Corinthian church at the time. The Corinthians, after they listened to Paul, obviously didn't get the message, and so they got sent another letter by someone later on saying, yep, you guys are still acting like idiots. It's kind of a funny letter, actually. If you get a chance to read it, it's not a bad read. But the book of First Clement seems to refer to all the major sections of the New Testament. That is, you have quotes and references to things that are found in the Gospels, Acts, the Pauline epistles, the Catholic epistles, and Revelation. So, in these more established churches, even within the 1st century, they seem to have a pretty complete understanding of what the New Testament is. And in particular, I wanted to mention this. First Clement does make use of things that are found in James and in 2 Peter. Okay, so it is a very early source, 1st century source, that comments on James and 2 Peter, and there's later ones, as we'll see, and you guys can see on the screen, that do call James and 2 Peter into question. But as far as First Clement is concerned, writing in the 1st century, James and 2 Peter seem to be very well established in the canon of Scripture and very well understood to be New Testament Scripture. Now, into the 2nd century, we get a couple of interesting sources, namely Irenaeus and also the Muratorian fragment. Later on in the 3rd century, you get Origen. And all of these people, First Clement all the way down through Origen, on the screen they're marked in green, and the reason why they're marked in green is because they don't actually go through and list what is canonical and what is not. Instead, they're just kind of rambling through the material. First Clement doesn't actually list any of the books. It's a letter to the Corinthians and happens to quote Scripture and reference Scripture. Irenaeus, the Muratorian fragment, and Origen, they're not necessarily trying to go through and make a canonical list either. They're just talking about specific books that are used and not. And so you can't really put them in view of canonical or not because that's not the intention behind them. And also the Muratorian fragment is actually incomplete. So we can't say too much about it. But the point is that even though they're not necessarily meaning to provide a list, they do talk about certain books. And so they provide early evidence of a lot of these books. Irenaeus goes through and he talks about some of the books. And what he lists as being a part of the New Testament is very interesting. he adds certain parts to the canon that we don't have today, and he also omits certain parts that we do have today. And like I said, the omission isn't necessarily to say that it wasn't canonical, it's just to say that he didn't talk about it there, because like I said, most of them are discussions of different things that are being used and this kind of thing. They're not necessarily meant to provide an actual canon list. But as to what he would seems to add to the canon, he mentions the Shepherd of Hermas and also the Book of Wisdom. Now, there are probably some of you who are looking through my Old Testament presentation on the canon, and you notice that I talked about most of the apocryphal books except for Wisdom, the Wisdom of Solomon. And the reason for that is because the early people who talk about the Wisdom of Solomon more often than not actually put it with the New Testament writings than the Old. That is, most of the early listers understood that the Old Testament was fixed, that it was closed. And they really liked this Book of Wisdom, and since we can't put it in the Old Testament, we're going to put it in the New. That seems to be in the understanding. And Irenaeus also likes the Shepherd of Hermas. Now, he doesn't talk about Philemon, and that's not surprising because Philemon's pretty small. He also doesn't talk about Jude. Jude is also pretty small. He doesn't talk about James. James is a bit bigger, and so it's a little bit hard to explain that. But like I said, this is also still during the 2nd century when you're dealing with the Gnostics, and so you tend to have kind of an overexertion of the things of Paul and kind of a de-emphasis on the Catholic epistles in general, so it's not necessarily odd that he would leave James out. And Irenaeus was very much so involved in the Gnostic heresies. His book Against Heresies was written primarily against Gnostics. And so it's not odd that he would de-emphasize some of the Catholic epistles like Jude and James. But like I said, Jude is pretty small. He just simply may not have had reason to use it. James was probably because he was dealing with the Gnostics. And then also 2 Peter, being a part of the Catholic epistles, was also probably due to the fact that he was dealing with Gnostics. But he does leave those out. The Muratorian fragments. In some ways it seems to predate Irenaeus. Some people put it later. You can make an argument for putting the Muratorian fragment first and then Irenaeus, or Irenaeus then the Muratorian fragment. I just went Irenaeus and then Muratorian. Not for any particular reason. Like I said, there are arguments either way, but both of them are 2nd century. Both people, most scholars date both of them to the 2nd century pretty easily. The Muratorian fragment also adds some parts to the New Testament canon that we don't accept. It also adds wisdom, saying that it was written by the friends of Solomon, and it also puts it as part of the New Testament because he saw the Old Testament, the writer of the Muratorian fragment. That is, nobody is actually sure exactly on who wrote the Muratorian fragment. Some people think it was Caius, and I happen to be one of them. I think it was probably Caius, but there's a few other people that got brought up. I think Hippolytus is one of them that sometimes people think it is. We're not exactly sure who, but whoever it was seemed to think that the Book of Wisdom, because the Old Testament was fixed, that wisdom should go with the New Testament. He also adds the Apocalypse of Peter, but he also goes ahead and he says that it's disputed, that some people are okay with using it in the church and some people don't like it being used in the church. He admits that there was some dispute about it, but he seems to really like it. And this is one of those things that happens with a certain amount of confusion. It also depends on who the Christian leader is who introduces this to you. It's very likely that they just got some bad information from someone who picked up the Apocalypse of Peter and really liked it, or even genuinely thought that it was supposed to be part of the canon and didn't really know the full history, but wound up including it. But as far as people who list the Apocalypse of Peter as actually being a part of the canon, as you can see on the list, the writer of the Muratorian fragment is completely alone in that. He's the only one who mentions the Apocalypse of Peter. Now, the Muratorian fragment is incomplete. It doesn't mention the first part of the list is cut off and the last part of the list is cut off. So some of these books that it omits, it may have actually intended to put in there, and it may have been a part of the original, but we don't know. As it exists now, the Muratorian fragment omits Hebrews, it omits James, and also omits 1st and 2nd Peter. It is interesting that it does have Jude, it does have Revelation, it does have at least 1st and 2nd John, and with the way that it's said, I believe it's also 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, but some people will dispute that, so you could put 3rd John on the list here. But with the way that it's said in the canon and certain things that are happening historically, especially with these smaller books, I believe that it references all of them. And the issue is this. In the Muratorian fragment, it says, early on it talks about the first epistle of John. And then it also later on talks about the other epistle of John. And you look at some of the other early Christian writers, and they will sometimes seem to imply that some of the smaller epistles were actually put together on one parchment, on one scroll, and were basically considered together. Like 1st and 2nd Peter, for example, sometimes you only find references to one epistle of Peter because the two were put together on one roll, and the same thing seems to have happened with 2nd and 3rd John. So the Muratorian fragment is actually probably referencing all three, even though it only represents two distinct manuscripts. That second manuscript probably had both 2nd and 3rd John on it. But this is somewhat conjectural, so you might, on the list of things that it omits from the canon, you might put 3rd John on there as well. Like I said, in my analysis, I don't find that to be super likely, especially that one would be mentioned without the other. But it's a possibility, and so I just want to be honest with you guys about that. Origen. When we get to Origen, this is in the 3rd century. The Christian groups have been talking to each other for a couple of centuries now, and there's much more unanimity on what is in the New Testament canon. And now nothing that we have in our New Testament is omitted. All the major parts are there, and there's also one addition that Origen puts in, and that is the Book of Wisdom. And like we said, Irenaeus, even in the Muratorian fragment, and Origen, they all put wisdom into the New Testament section. Origen is different, though, in that he says that the Book of Wisdom is disputed. And this came to be an understanding of what the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament was. The Old Testament was time before Christ. The New Testament was the time of Christ. The Book of Wisdom didn't really fit into either category. And that the early Christian authors saw the Old Testament as being closed, and wisdom came after that, so wisdom obviously wasn't a part of the Old Testament. But it also was seeming not to belong to the New Testament, and then the New Testament was the time of Christ. And it was written by people who were first or second witnesses of Christ. And so wisdom kind of came to be in this odd little place. And so Origen says that, there are some people who doubt that this book should be in the canon. And a question that would come up that's very legit is, why would we have it in there in the first place? And well, if you read through the Book of Wisdom, it is just that. It's a book of wisdom, of good moral principles for leading your life and good godly principles. And most of what it says in that regard, we really wouldn't have any huge issues with. But the question is whether or not it actually satisfies the criterion for canonicity. Not just whether it's good and godly, but whether or not it's actually God-inspired writing. And this was kind of the contention that you have. And like I said, these early listers, they're not necessarily talking about canonical versus non-canonical, what is the rule of the faith and what isn't. They're usually referencing it more in terms of use. This is what Christians do use, this is what Christians don't use. And so the Book of Wisdom, by all means, can be used by Christians and can be a really good reference, just as a lot of books can be a really good reference for living a Christian life. And even today, we have tons of books that are out there that talk about living a Christian life and offer, pretty good, sound, godly wisdom on it. And there's also a lot that offer terrible advice on it. But it's one of those things that just happens. You have books that it can be used by a particular church or church institution, and even on a fairly broad base, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're canonical. It just means that they're used. And so Origen is kind of in the cusp of where they're really trying to figure out exactly what to do with wisdom. They know that it's a godly book that has godly principles in it, but the question that is there is whether or not it's canon. And like I said, the early ones were saying it doesn't belong to the Old Testament because the Old Testament's closed. Like I talked about in the last one, it's just the 22 books, and now it's going on, and so the only other place to put it is in the New Testament, but it doesn't really seem like it fits with the New Testament either, because it was written before the time of Christ. So what do you do with it? Now, you go into the 4th century and you get into Eusebius, and Eusebius is the great church historian. Now, he actually kind of showed up indirectly last time when we talked about the Old Testament. He is the one who records what Josephus had to say about the Old Testament canon. And so what Josephus said in the 1st century could also be taken as what Eusebius said in the 4th century. And so we basically traded out Josephus for Eusebius when we're talking about the New Testament. Eusebius, he goes through and he, as far as what is canonical, what is the rule of faith in the church, he completely agrees. Excuse me for a moment. He completely agrees with what we have now. But at the same time, Eusebius was actually a pretty honest historian, and he said that some of the books were disputed, but they were still seen as canonical within the church. They were still used by the church and used as a guide and rule in the church. And so even though there were some disputes about them, especially about authorship, not necessarily about whether or not they should be used or whether or not they're a good guide to the faith, but it was mostly about authorship. He does list those, but as far as what is used as a guide to the faith, what is a rule of the faith, he has the exact same New Testament canon that we do. Then Athanasius in the 4th century, he also puts forward the exact same canon that we have in the New Testament. He doesn't add anything to it. He doesn't take anything away from it. And he also goes a little bit further than Eusebius in that he puts it forward without any qualification whatsoever. He says, these are the standard and the guide and the rule of the faith. These are canon. He does use that word. And he puts it forward as being something that is, by this point, it's established. Not really a whole lot of debate about it anymore, but as we'll see, there are still some debates that come up. Actually, very, very close to Athanasius, you also have Cyril talking about the New Testament. And Cyril, for the most part, is pretty much the same as what we have, but Cyril was also a part of the Eastern Church. And like I said, because of all the things that happened with Montanism, the Eastern Church wound up doubting Revelation. And like I said, in the West, they doubted Hebrews, although most of the ones in the West actually didn't remove Hebrews from the canonical list. They just argued about who wrote it. But in the East, they would actually sometimes completely remove Revelation. And Cyril was one of the ones who did remove Revelation. He agreed with every single one of the other books except for Revelation. And like I said, that was because of all the stuff that happened with Montanism. And then, just like we talked about with the Old Testament, the African Code also weighs in on the New Testament canon. Now, the African Code's New Testament canon is basically exactly the same as ours, except that it also does mention the Book of Wisdom. But here, when we get into the African Code in the 4th century, and it actually could be 4th, 5th century because Carthage was 5th century, but it started with the Council of Hippo in the 4th century, and some of those councils. But it specifically, they made a decision on what to do with wisdom, and they included wisdom in the Old Testament. That's what they decided to do with it, and this is basically where the Apocrypha comes from. It was these books that really didn't fit into either category. The Old Testament, by and large, was understood to be closed, and the New Testament, the requirement there that was understood was that it had to be from the time of Christ and the time of the apostles. And of course, a lot of the apocryphal books really didn't fit into that category. And so the solution that a lot of the Christians came up with, not that everyone agreed, I'd already discussed that in the last one on the Old Testament canon, on my last presentation, on the Old Testament canon, that is. Not everyone agreed, but one solution that a lot of people came up with was to basically expand the Old Testament canon, saying not only does it cover the time of the prophets, but it also includes all of this other material that is, good, godly stuff. But like I said, there was a lot of debate about that, and a lot of the church fathers, even afterwards, they didn't agree with what the African Code put forward on that one. And when they listed the Old Testament scripture, they did not list the apocryphal books as being canonical. But it's interesting, in particular for the Book of Wisdom, that we see it being moved, that it was originally considered a part of the New Testament because the Old Testament was closed. And then as they started being more specific about what the New Testament was, particularly that it was um, supposed to be representative of Christ and the apostles, it became evident that the Book of Wisdom didn't fit there. And so they basically forced open the Old Testament canon and basically redefined what the Old Testament canon was. Now, in the 4th and 5th centuries, you have Rufinus, and I also mentioned him last time when we talked about the Old Testament canon, and he agrees with what we have in our New Testament canon today. He doesn't have wisdom in there, and he also doesn't have wisdom in his Old Testament either. He doesn't mention some of the other books that showed up from time to time, like the Shepherd of Hermas and the Apocalypse of Peter and those. It's just what we have today. And before I forget to mention it, the Shepherd of Hermas is interesting that in the Muratorian fragment it talks about it, and you notice that the Muratorian fragment doesn't put it in the canon. And the reason why is because the author of the Muratorian fragment knew where the Shepherd of Hermas come from. He said it was written in his own time. And of course, that means that it doesn't belong to the time of Christ and the first apostles. It certainly isn't Old Testament, and so it doesn't really belong in the canon in that sense. It's obviously a Christian writing, but it is not a canonical writing. And that understanding, as Christians came to understand that and understand where these different books came from, they started saying, yeah, Shepherd of Hermas is great and all, but we probably shouldn't include it in the canon anymore because it's not from the right time period. We can't trust this as being a canonical scripture because this wasn't someone who was an eye or ear witness of Christ. This is too far removed. Also, the Apocalypse of Peter, the same thing happened with it. They realized where it came from, and they understood that this was actually one of the heretical teachings. This is, if I remember correctly, this is actually one of the Gnostic ones. And they said, yeah, we probably shouldn't be using that. It's supposedly written by Peter, but as they learned more of the history about it, they figured out it wasn't written by Peter, and there were certain things in it that just didn't match up with the rest of the Gospels and the other teachings of the New Testament. And they said, while there are some good things in here, not all of it is good. And one of the frequent statements that they had is, gall shouldn't be mixed with honey. Yeah, some things are good, but not all of it is. There are some parts of this that we would agree with, but there are some parts that are not even historically accurate. They're spurious. Nah, not going to have them in there. And like I said, wisdom generally got moved to the Old Testament by some people, not by all. And then finally into the 7th and 8th centuries, you get John of Damascus. And his New Testament is very close to ours, but he also includes a collection that is called the Teaching of the Apostles. It's also sometimes referred to as the Canons of the Apostles. And this is kind of a strange one in that it gets added on incredibly late. There are actually people who talked about it earlier, but they talked about it as being a non-canonical work for the most part. And John of Damascus puts it in as canonical, which is a little bit strange. And so, yeah, most people today don't go with John because this is a very, very late commentary here, and obviously quite a bit removed from the time of Christ, and pretty much at odds with everybody else on the list. Alright, so that's kind of an overview of the major lists that are out there as per the Hendrickson collection and as per Metzger. And Metzger actually has a few things in addition to that, but I decided to go with stuff that you could find references to in both sources. I don't think Metzger reproduces all of First Clement, but I think he does talk about it. But the rest of these you can find in Hendrickson and in one form or another in Metzger. I don't know if Metzger talks about Rufinus. First Clement and Rufinus I'm not sure if Metzger talks about, but they are in Hendrickson, in the Hendrickson collection. Okay. But as you can see, for the most part there was a good amount of unanimity on these things. And there are 3 of the Church Fathers who have complete agreement with us. The early ones don't have complete agreement with us because they weren't really listing canons. They were talking about what was used and what wasn't, which is not the same thing as canon, and so we wouldn't expect them to completely agree with us. Cyril's a little bit off, but like I said, that's because of the whole thing that happened with Montanism and the doubt and created there. The African Code does talk about the Book of Wisdom. It moves it to the Old Testament, and that's kind of an evidence that wisdom was kind of in an awkward spot, and the Christians actually wound up redefining what the Old Testament was to include the Apocrypha. And so even though it's a little bit off, we would still use it as evidence to say, hey, you guys did change things when it comes to traditional Christianity. They did. The early church fathers recognized that the Old Testament canon was closed, and the African Code and some of these things actually changed the understanding of what the Old Testament was. It was very obviously a change. And then there's John of Damascus, who's just kind of out from everybody else, and including the teaching of the apostles as being a New Testament canonical work. And as far as we can tell, it doesn't fit in with the chronology for the rest of the New Testament stuff. The New Testament was written in the New Testament era, before the close of the first century, and the teaching of the apostles at earliest the second century. A lot of people put it in the third or fourth century, though. And like you said, we don't have any major lister listing it until the 7th and 8th centuries. So for the most part, a good deal of unanimity on what the New Testament is. And like I said, even in the first century, with First Clement, there seems to be a pretty good understanding of what the New Testament is supposed to be. Alright, so let's talk about the available attestation. So you go through and you look at the actual evidence that we have for it. Now, in the Old Testament, I said we were comparing things to the Gospels because in Christian literature, there's nothing better supported than the Gospels. That's what they're going to talk about first and foremost. So the Gospels represent 100% of the attestation that's available. And in producing these numbers, I went primarily with Hendrickson, augmented by Metzger, and we're talking, in this slide that I have on the screen right now, I'm talking specifically about just the canon. Just the canon itself. Alright, so, like I said, Gospels represent 100% of the attestation. And what's interesting is that 1 John actually has just as much evidence for it as the Gospels do. So if you want to talk about the two best supported parts of the New Testament, that would be the Gospels, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then also 1 John. If there's any books that are unequivocally Christian and set forward Christian doctrine, it's those five, the Gospels and 1 John. A very close contender is Acts with 93% of the available attestation. Like we said, we don't necessarily expect the other books to be as high as the Gospels, but it is interesting that Acts is very high. Revelation is actually quite high, even despite the fact that it was doubted by those in the East, like Cyril and others. It actually turned out with to have quite a bit of evidence for it, almost 90%. It's 89% of the available, which is pretty good. 1 Peter, even though it's one of the Catholic epistles, and because of Gnosticism it was doubted from time to time, it still winds up with a good amount of attestation, 87%. And the same thing is true of 2nd and 3rd John. Even though it was doubted by some, it still came out with quite a bit of evidence. Then you have Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus, all having about 86% of the available attestation. And as you know, these are a lot of the archetypical books of Paul that are even today still frequently used as a very much so a major source of teaching in the church. And the listing that we have here is more or less by use and authority. That is, while some of the books were in the New Testament were arranged chronologically, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but like the Gospels, for example, as far as what the Church Fathers said, they're in our Bibles they're actually arranged chronologically according to what the Church Fathers said. There are modern scholars who disagree, but the Church Fathers said that they were ordered chronologically. Paul, on the other hand, doesn't seem to be listed chronologically, and said his is doctrinal relevance. That is, Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians come first, because Romans is basically the basic understanding of our salvation, and First and Second Corinthians is about correcting errors in the church. And then you have his other main ones after that. You get into the pastoral epistles, First and Second Timothy, Titus, Philemon to a certain extent, and those. Now, when we get into Philemon, though, Philemon was pretty small, and so a lot of the early church fathers didn't really have a lot of reason to use it, and so its attestation is smaller than for a lot of the Pauline epistles in general. And then you also have Hebrews, and there was a lot of doubt concerning Hebrews because of the whole thing that happened with Montanism, and there was a lot of doubts that were running, especially in the Western Church's mind, regarding Hebrews. So it's only 77% of the available attestation, so it's pretty low. Jude also has 77% of the available attestation. It shows up pretty early, but there's some people who talk about it and some people who omit it. And like I said, part of that is just because it's a small book. 2 Peter is also pretty heavily disputed, all things considered. 67%, and then there's James with 64. Now, it's still a majority of the attestation that's available, even though people did raise objections to these last few books, especially 2 Peter and James. But like I said, they do show up in the earliest records like 1 Clement, and so it doesn't really particularly bother me. There is very early evidence for them, and if later people decide to argue about it, well, that's on them. But as far as early evidence goes, even though these ones are disputed by later generations, they do show up in the first century time period, so I'm not really greatly worried about them. But like we did with the Old Testament, I had you guys look at the last book on the list of canonical books, which is Esther, and had you guys look at that percentage, and then we compared it to the non-canonical books, and then we're going to do the same here. So, for the canonical books of the New Testament, James is the one with the least amount of support at 64% of the available. Now let's move into the non-canonical books. The one with the most support for the non-canonical books, that we would call non-canonical, is the Book of Wisdom. And like I said, the Book of Wisdom eventually wound up getting moved to the Old Testament because it just didn't really fit with the New Testament, and early on it didn't fit with the Old Testament either, but they changed their definition of the Old Testament to accommodate it and the other apocryphal works. But it has only 20% of the available attestation, so there's more than a 40% gap between the least supported canonical work and the best supported non-canonical book of the New Testament, which is a pretty significant gap. Now, and we also get into the other non-canonical works, and most of them are very much so spoken against by the early church fathers, like the Shepherd of Hermas, even though it is mentioned by Irenaeus as being scriptural, and he seems to be like the only one who does that, is calling it actual scriptural, as actually calling it scriptural, not just good to read. Even though there were some people that liked it, the vast majority of the church fathers disapproved of it at a rate of negative 30%. They were speaking against it more often than not. Also, you have the teaching and canons of the apostles, which John of Damascus seemed to like, but everybody else was, not everybody else, but vast majority of other people were against, also negative 30%. The Apocalypse of Peter. It gets brought up in the Muratorian canon, but other people who know the history behind it and know where it comes from and knows that it is Gnostic say, you don't want to have anything to do with that. There are good things in it, but not all of it is. And so, you know, this is fictitious. Parts of it were made up, and it was made to seem like other New Testament works, but really wasn't. Also, the Gospel of Thomas shows up in the list, and the Gospel of Thomas has received a lot of media attention lately. But you have to remember that the Gospel of Thomas was, of course, written later. The Church Fathers were unanimous on saying, no, this is not really a gospel. And what is more about it is that the Gospel of Thomas and a lot of the other supposedly New Testament works, this is why they're usually referred to as pseudepigrapha, are false. They're false writings. I think it was the Gospel of Thomas, for example, that said that the Sea of Galilee was not in Israel. Obviously, the writer of the Gospel of Thomas had never been to Israel. Otherwise, he would know that the Sea of Galilee is there. And this is something that you find with a lot of these ones. I mean, there's the Acts of Peter, which is kind of interesting. The Gospel of Peter, the preaching of Peter, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, letter to the Laodiceans, Alexandrians. All of these ones are spoken against more often than not by the early church fathers. And if you go through and read them for yourself, and a lot of them are still extant, you can still read at least portions of them. And you can see why they were identified as spurious very early on. The Gospel of Peter, for example, has just really strange, more than anything else. In it, the cross that Jesus is hung on somehow makes it into the tomb with him. I'm not sure how that happens. And then when Christ is led out of the tomb, the cross gets up and walks and follows him, and the cross actually talks, which is just kind of weird, and it really doesn't have anything to do with the gospel message at all, but interesting. But this is the thing. People at the time, they liked fiction just as much as we do, and we have fictitious books that even relate to religious things as well. And that doesn't mean, though, that we're going to call those fictions scripture, though. Just as in those days, they were very careful to say, no, these are fictions, these aren't scripture. And Eusebius actually went so far as to call them not only spurious, not only rejected, but he also called them absurd. He said, we really should invent a new categorization for these books. We should really call them absurd books. And some of them are pretty absurd. Acts of Paul and Thecla, for example, is another good one. In the Acts of Paul and Thecla, Paul baptizes a lion, and then he gets thrown to the lion, and the lion refuses to eat him because the lion was baptized by Paul, which is interesting. I'm not sure how many people would go around baptizing animals. Not exactly a standard Christian practice there, but it makes for good fiction. And other little letters here and there, like Laodiceans, for example, was anti-docetic, which was a later heresy that developed more so in the 2nd century. And so, and it's supposedly written by Paul, but the only problem is that Paul wouldn't have interacted with the docetics, and so he couldn't have written an anti-docetic work, and so that kind of doesn't work. But there are some interesting that happens here in the Pseudepigrapha. Like I said, in the West, they had doubts about Hebrews. But there still seems to be this kind of innate, inborn understanding in the early Christians that the New Testament was supposed to have 27 books. And since in the West they doubted the book of Hebrews, they took along from time to time, not always, but they took along from time to time the letter to the Laodiceans. Well, we're missing one letter from Paul, the Hebrews, so we're going to put in another one to supplement it. That way we still have 27. There was this understanding that it was supposed to be 27 books. And in the East, like I said, they didn't always trust Revelation. Like Cyril, for example, Cyril leaves out Revelation. And in its place, they would put in the teaching or the canons of the apostles, like John of Damascus does, for example. He adds the teaching of the apostles. And so there was this understanding that it needed to be 27 books. That's what it was supposed to be, and since these groups had, some concerns over some of the books, they basically filled in other books to make up the difference. But you can see that there is still this very deep understanding, deep-rooted understanding that it was supposed to be 22 for the Old Testament, which is what I talked about last time, and 27 for the New Testament. But, like I said, by and large, most of these books were, on the grand scale of things, rejected. Even ones that were taken as having fairly good teachings in them, like Shepherd and the teaching canons of the apostles, even the Laodiceans was viewed as being, relatively good Christian stuff. It just wasn't something that belonged in the canon of the New Testament, because the canon of the New Testament was supposed to cover the time of Christ and the early apostles, and these didn't reflect that. And like I said, the Book of Wisdom, it was pretty quickly removed from being something that was considered in the New Testament, also for the same reason. It wasn't from the time of Christ and the apostles, so it obviously didn't belong there. And there was a number of early church fathers who also said that it didn't belong in the Old Testament either. And so we go along with that, and we don't use the Book of Wisdom at all, which isn't to say it's necessarily a bad or an evil book. It's just simply not canonical. But some church groups got around that by expanding the Old Testament to include the apocryphal books, like the Book of Wisdom. They basically changed the definition of what the Old Testament was. Instead of a fixed number of books at 22, they changed it basically to be whatever books the church deems useful. And there's definitely an inherent contention there. Alright, so that talks about most of the historical influences that happened and how much support we have for it and things like that. Let's move into some interesting quotes from some of the early Christians. Now, when I talked about the Old Testament canon, I gave quotes from Josephus, from Cyril, I think it was it from Cyril? Definitely Rufinus. Yeah, and Cyril. And those statements would apply just as equally to the New Testament in the broadest sense, in that Josephus, Josephus wouldn't as much because he was talking very specifically about the Old Testament, but Cyril does talk about the New Testament and its importance and its authority. Rufinus talks about all of Scripture in general, and says that it is what we are to use to adduce the proofs of our faith. And here on the screen before you is a quote from Athanasius. And this is a very interesting quote. This is what Athanasius says before he goes off and he lists the canon of Scripture, both Old Testament and New Testaments. This is what he says. He says, "It seemed good to me also, having been urged hereto by true brethren, and having learned what took place from the beginning, to set before you the books included in the canon, and handed down, and accredited as divine, all to the end that anyone who has fallen into error may condemn those who have led him astray, and that he who has continued steadfast in purity may again rejoice at having these things brought to his remembrance." I'm going to have a slightly Pentecostal moment here. Amen, Athanasius. Amen. I in so many ways agree with what Athanasius is saying here. And this is part of Athanasius's festal letter, his Easter letter, that told the churches on what day the church as a whole was going to celebrate Easter. And he decided that in this letter that was going out to everyone telling them when they were going to celebrate Easter, he also needed to put in there a list of canonical Scripture. And his basis for it is very interesting. He starts off by saying, first of all, this canon that I'm giving you guys can be trusted because I have taken the time to learn what took place from the beginning. I've taken the time to learn what was handed down. And this is like a lot of the early church fathers. When you read them concerning the canon of Scripture, they do not say that this is something that the church decided upon, that this was something that was decided in council, anything like that. Instead, they keep saying this was handed down, this is what from the beginning. This is what has been consistently taught in the church from the beginning. It wasn't something that was decided upon. There wasn't a period in which Christians, just didn't have a Bible at all, and then the church got it together or anything like that. And you can even read Justin Martyr on that when he describes early church services in the 2nd century. 2nd century, he says that the focal point of the church service was the reading of Scripture, Old Testament, the time of the prophets, and the New Testament, the time of the apostles. That's how Justin Martyr sets it up. And that's what we use as evangelicals as our standards of canonicity today. The Old Testament is from the prophets, the New Testament is from the early apostles. Same basic standards, and this is something that was handed down from the beginning. This was not something that was decided by committee. This is not something that was decided by church councils. When Athanasius is saying this, he's not saying, us bishops, we got together and we decided this. He's saying, no, the history is sufficient. This is what the historical record has to say. And this is what we take as being divine Scripture. This is the Word of God, and that is authoritative in and of itself. But his purpose, that's what I really want to get to. Why is it that he's listing this? Not just so that they would understand what took place from the beginning and what has been handed down, but he says specifically that he's doing this that anyone who has fallen into error may condemn those who have led him astray. That anyone who has fallen into error may condemn those who have led him astray. What is the purpose of the canon? What is the purpose of having a set of authoritative books that is the guide and the rule of the faith? What is the purpose? So we don't fall into error. And if we do fall into error, we can look at the people who led us into error and say, you did us wrong. That is that is exactly the Protestant affirmation. That is exactly how evangelicals view the canon. And this is Athanasius writing this in the mid-4th century. Amen, Athanasius. Amen. So be it. So let it be. That is the purpose of the canon, and that is from the horse's mouth, so to speak. This is the statement of the early church fathers. You can find it in Cyril, you can find it in Rufinus, you can find it in Athanasius. Obviously, you can even find references to this idea of using it as a standard and a guide in Clement and in Irenaeus. And when I say Clement, I mean Clement of Alexandria, not the author of First Clement, although First Clement would probably be in agreement on that as well, but he doesn't really get in to issues of canonicity. He's more interested in talking about the Corinthian church and how all the ways that they messed up, and it's just kind of funny. But the early church fathers that I've read on this, very universal agreement that Scripture is a standard to know what is in the faith and what isn't. And that those of us who have maintained the faith, we can rejoice in it because we look at Scripture and say, yes, this is what I believe. But for those of us who have not stayed true to the faith, either because we were incorrectly taught or because we willingly left it, when we look at Scripture, it serves as a source of rebuke, either for us who willingly left it or as a source of rebuke for the people who led us astray. This is what Athanasius says, and this is exactly what the Protestant Reformation was all about. Looking at the traditional church and the traditional churches, both the Western and Eastern, and then also some of the other groups as well, and saying, you guys got it wrong. What you're teaching is not in accord with Scripture. No. I mean, in the West, for example, they were selling indulgences, get out of jail free pass as long as you pay enough money. We'll pray for you and then you'll get out. And that was a major understanding that actually was both in the West and the East. For the Protestant Reformation, we're most familiar with it in the West, this idea of, substitutionary prayer, if you will, that helped people and got people out of things. But this idea was just kind of an element of medieval Christianity in general, and it's also a major part of the Western view as well. The Western Church specifically puts it in terms of icons. They don't necessarily put it in terms of purgatory, but this idea of substitutionary prayer is still a very big part of the Eastern Church's thinking. And you can especially see it in their iconography. They use icons in their church, and they're basically pictures or images of Christ and the saints. And this is something that, first of all, it didn't occur in early Christianity. A lot of early Christians said, yeah, we don't do that. Who was Octavius Felix said, Christians have no recognized images other than the cross. Leto said that the idea of using images at all in representation of God is just a false idea because you diminish God as his own mediator. You diminish the work of Christ when you do that. Irenaeus said specifically that those who use images have fallen into the error of the Gnostics. And in Eastern thinking, you can see a lot of Gnostic influence in what they do. So this is definitely not something that was originally taught, but they nonetheless do it. And their argument usually goes something like, well, we have pictures of our loved ones in our home. How come we can't have pictures of the loved ones, of the church in the church? What's the difference? And the difference is actually pretty blanket. Take the same thing that they do with the icons and see if that really applies to family photos. In the East, and especially in the more traditional Eastern churches, I'm not talking about the American Orthodox Church. The American Orthodox Church actually isn't very much like the other Orthodox churches. But in the more traditional Orthodox churches, they bow down and before the images. Could you imagine what would happen with that if you did that in the home with your home photos? Take the kids around and say, okay, we're going to go through the family album now, and when you see the picture of great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy, you need to bow down. And when you see the picture of great-great-grandma, you need to kiss her. And we're going to have special days set aside to celebrate it. This is great-granddad's day. This is great-great-great-great-great-grandma's day. And remember to bow down at the right points and kiss the picture at the right points and all of this other stuff. Would you do that? Is it really the same? I don't think you would treat pictures of your family that way. I think that would be a little weird. Okay, yes, you might have kids kiss the pictures from time to time, and I mean, frankly, I've even done that when I miss people in my family and whatnot. But bowing down before them, that's a little bit strange. But the iconography goes even further, and that they are seen as having a mediating role, this idea of substitutionary prayer that I was talking about earlier. That is, hanging an icon in your home or in the church is seen as being a way of warding off evil spirits, as if God didn't care enough about his church that he needed to be reminded by the saints who are saying, hey, by the way, my picture's here and you need to help them out. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But I actually have heard from Eastern Orthodox people who say, there was this thing that was happening in the church and there was lots of contention as a result of it. And we looked up and there was the icon of St. Andrew on the wall, and then there was a peace that fell over all of us because we remembered the icon. I mean, what's the difference between that and the pagan talismans? I rub the talisman and then everything goes fine from there. It's the same idea. That's not scriptural at all. You don't see anywhere in Scripture where they say, use images first of all, but second of all, saying that these kinds of things have any power in that sense. And then there's the whole issue of having the saints who are represented in these icons pray on our behalf. I mean, what is the point of Paul saying that there is only one mediator between God and man, and that is the man Jesus Christ, if it is the case that we're going to have all these other people intercede for us? I mean, does God care about us personally or not? Well, it just doesn't make any sense when you put it in those terms. First of all, believing that the dead are going to pray for you just isn't a concept that's supported in the canonical scriptures, first of all. But also the idea that they could do anything beyond what Christ could do. Christ is our mediator. That's what Paul said. We have one mediator between God and man. We don't have other people pray for us. We pray to Christ, and it is Christ who intercedes for us. It is Christ who is our mediator. Now, do we pray for other people? Yes. We do pray for other people in the sense that we pray that God would lead them to Christ and so on. But at the same time, that doesn't overrule the sovereignty of God in any major way. And in the traditional churches, and especially through the medieval period, prayer became this substitutionary act in and of itself. And you just don't see that in Scripture. And so there are those of us who are looking at what Athanasius says, and we say we've fallen into error. This isn't what Scripture says to do. Yes, we are to remember those who go before us. Paul is specific about this. And I'm very adamant that we do remember our Christian history as well. In so much as Scripture teaches it, I'm with that. We do need to remember our Christian history. We do need to know our Christian history. We need to know the heroes of the faith. But at the same time, if we're doing something that is not in accord with Scripture that hurts the overall Christian message, then it becomes a problem. Okay, frankly, there's no point in which I'm going to pray to a saint when I can go directly into the throne room of grace. That's what Hebrews says. We can go confidently into the throne room of grace. If I can go confidently into the throne room of grace, why on earth would I ask someone who is dead to pray for me? If I have a plea for my brother, why don't I just go directly into the throne room myself to plea for my brother? Yes, some people are not going to pray for themselves because they don't know God yet. That is where you intercede for them. Or people say, let us both go together. Pray for me with the understanding that I'm going to be praying for myself, and we will both go and make petition before the Lord. But the understanding there is still that the individual can come into the throne room of grace. Not that you have to send someone else in, not that you're going to ask someone else to go in for you. And that is my big problem with the traditional churches, is that they become a source of mediation. It is not Christ who is the mediator anymore. You cannot go confidently into the throne room of grace anymore. You're several steps removed. It's still gracious, they would say, but you're removed from that grace, from what the biblical model is. Hebrews doesn't put it like that. Paul doesn't put it like that, and I'm speaking specifically of the Timothys. That is not what Christian teaching is. That is not what the gospel says. And so, like Athanasius, I would say the same thing. We've been led into error by that medieval Christianity, and there are things that crept in that were wrong. And I'm being much more forceful this time in talking about the New Testament than I am in the Old Testament. And I want you guys to understand that I do have friends who are still members of traditional Christianity. There's actually a fellow that I work with at my school who is very devout Roman Catholic and actually does active service in his church. And I want you to understand that while I have definite disagreements with him about this kind of stuff, that doesn't mean that I hate him at all. And I also have friends who have very strong Eastern Orthodox connections as well. And I want you guys to understand that I don't have anything against them per se, except that there are things that their beliefs lead to that are not scriptural. Okay, as far as the icons themselves are concerned, I don't really care if you decide to hang a picture in church or not. I'm not going to be like Jerome and go and rip it down and say, here, wind this around a dead person. Jerome actually did that, by the way. I'm not going to be that forceful about it. But the problem is that it leaves a lot of room for error. It leaves a lot of room for people to stumble and fall, and room for things to come in that are not a part of Christian teaching, and certainly not from the beginning. And especially this idea of substitutionary prayer and substitutionary mediation is not scriptural, but it is very much a part of traditional Christianity, both the West and in the East, and it greatly concerns me. Now, traditional Christians, I understand, are going to disagree with me on that, and me ranting about it isn't really going to change that. I don't think so, at least. It would be nice if it did, but probably not going to happen. But I just will leave it at this. I want it to be clear why evangelicals are so strongly opposed to these things. It's not because the picture in and of itself is what's the issue. Okay, we understand the argument. You use pictures at home. Why not use them in the church? We get that. The question is, what else are you doing with those pictures? Okay, you don't bow down before pictures of grandma. Don't genuflect when you see pictures of grandpa. You don't have special days set aside for each person in the family photo book. You don't do that. And you certainly don't think that they have an intercessory role for you, and that they're intermediaries for you, or that they, just because you hang them on the wall, that they're suddenly going to make things turn out nice. These are very foreign concepts to early church Christianity, and greatly, greatly concern me. And that is, I think, the general concern that most evangelicals would have. It's not the acts in and of itself. Okay, if you really want to have a statue of Mary in the house, go for it. You really need a crucifix, whatever. But it's the other things that you do with it. In and of itself, none of these things are necessarily good or bad. As Christians, we have a lot of freedoms. We understand a lot of things. There's, like Paul says, one person can eat food sacrificed to all idols and not be affected by it because he knows that an idol is nothing. But for those who are tempted to bow down and worship these things, participating in such a ritual would definitely be damaging to their faith. And while having an icon in the church, or having some kind of image in the church, in and of itself isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just a picture. But what people do with it, and what it can do to people's faith, becomes the concern. And that's why evangelicals and Protestants in general usually don't have a whole lot of iconography, a lot of images. We usually will have a picture of Jesus somewhere, but we don't emphasize it nearly as much as the traditional churches do, just because there's lots of room for abuse. And you violate the principle of coming confidently into the throne room of grace. You violate the principle that we only have one mediator between God and man. Like I said, for traditional Christians, I'm probably not going to be very convincing, but at least hopefully through this little rant you can see the point, you can see what we're coming to this with, and you can see the concern. It's not that you have it in the church, it's what it winds up leading to that concerns us. And I put that forward as a friend of both Western and Eastern Christians. At least I hope they still consider me their friend. Yes, I disagree with you guys on some things. But at the same time, I still love you guys. And I just want you to understand what the point of view is. Just like Athanasius says, if anyone has fallen into error, the way you're going to know that you've fallen into error is it in the canon or not? It is a guide, it is a standard, and that is very clearly what the early church fathers said. Moving on. That was heavy enough. Let's move on to something else. This one is an interesting one, and I absolutely love this in a lot of ways. This is a quote that actually comes from China, if you can believe that, and I'm going to severely mispronounce the name, so if anyone who is Chinese or knows any of the Chinese dialects hears this, I sincerely apologize for my mispronunciation, but I think it's supposed to be Hixianfu, and I probably utterly murdered that, but from Hixianfu, China. And there's a monument that's there, and this is what it says on it. It says, after his, that is referring to Christ, great works were completed, he ascended at midday to his true home. 27 holy books were left behind concerning him. And this is a monument that was erected in the 8th century. And this is something that Metzer talks about in his book, The Canon of the New Testament, and it's on page 222 if you want to look it up. But I bring this up to show that even the Christians who were very far spread out in their... Actually, Christianity spread considerably, and sometimes people don't realize it. There were actually Christian groups that made it into India and into China, and actually almost every major landmass on Earth except for Australia and Antarctica within the first millennium, which is kind of interesting. A lot of people don't know that. There's actually early Christian evidence of early Christians actually in the Americas even, which is interesting. And the one for the Americans is still somewhat tentative. What they did is they found first century Paleo-Hebrew script alongside crosses of Lorraine. And so it appears that somewhere along the line that first century Christians, as evidenced by the crosses, somehow made it over to the New World. And but like I said, there's going to need to be more archaeology done on that. But Christianity actually did spread quite far, and even into China. And the attestation that you get from China here is that there are 27 books in the New Testament, which is a pretty cool thing. That even in this far-flung place that's so far removed from the source of Christianity, as it were, geographically, that they would still agree that the New Testament is 27 books. That is really cool. And so, like I said, there's this idea in early Christianity that it is supposed to be 27 books. And even though in the East and in the West they disagreed about Revelation and Hebrews, and they supplemented other books in their place sometimes to make it fill out 27, even though all that happened, there was still this understanding that it was supposed to be 27 books. That seems to have been well known and well established. Alright, so that's a lot of the early church evidence and really cool things going on there. Let's move on from that a little bit into something that's it can be kind of contestable. Let's get into it. Alright, so the big question that often comes up in evangelical fundamental Protestant thought, and even it becomes an issue for the traditional churches as well, is which New Testament text do you use? That is, you look at different translations of the Bible, and sometimes you'll notice differences. And some of them can be pretty major differences. For example, Right now, and I'll give you a little bit of time to do this, but if you have a Bible handy, just go ahead and look up in your Bible John 5:4. Now, if you have an NIV or an ESV or one of the newer translations, you'll thumb through, you get to the book of John, you look at chapter 5, you start going through the verses, and you'll be looking for verse 4 and you won't find it in the main text. Sometimes you'll find it in a footnote, but you won't find it in the main text. Now, if you have a more traditional translation, like say the King James, the New King James, I think it's still included in the NASB, I think it's put in brackets though, a more traditional text, you will find John 5:4. There are differences. Some of the translations have it, some of them don't, and the question is, well, what's up with that? Why do some translations have it and why don't others? Well, that all has to do with textual criticism and things that we found going through the textual evidence and these kinds of things. Now, before we get too far into this, one thing that I want to set clear and very obvious is that there are textual critics out there who are completely idiotic as far as I'm concerned, and there are some myths that go around that are perpetuated by some of the more liberal critics that I want to just put to an end right here. The first myth that often goes around is that if you have a shorter text, that it's the original. Let's examine this for a few seconds and see if this is true. Now, this is the argument that a lot of critics use to date Mark before the other Gospels. They say, well, Mark is shorter, it shows signs of being more incomplete than the others, so it must have come before the other Gospels. Let's see if that's actually a good argument. Let's take Snow White, for example. Snow White, we're talking specifically about Disney's Snow White, the movie that came out. The movie is pretty long. The screenplay would be many pages for Snow White. It's a pretty long movie. Now, after the movie came out, there was also several picture books that Disney put out that went along with the movie. Now, which one of those was longer and which one was shorter? Which one was more complete? Which one was less complete? The movie that came first, or the little picture books that came after? Well, the movie is obviously more complete. It represents, kind of the authoritative tradition, as it were, because that's what it is. It is the movie that Disney put out. The picture books are a shortened form of it, and those came later. So shorter doesn't always mean that it came first. Sometimes something that's short can come later, and the same issue applies with the Gospels. If you look at the early church fathers and what they have to say about the order in which the Gospels are written, it's actually the same order that you find in the Bible nowadays. Matthew wrote first in Hebrew, and then it was very quickly translated into Greek by early Christians who knew what the Hebrew said, who could translate it accurately and adequately into Greek. And then Mark and Luke, and then last of all, John. The church fathers are pretty much unanimous on that. But still, you're going to have liberal critics out there who are saying, well, it's shorter, therefore it must have come first, and they always like to put Christianity in terms of development. It's kind of this evolution of the religion, if you will. It really started out here, and then it got changed into this. Well, no. You look at what the early Christians actually had to say about it, it wasn't like that at all. They had a very complete understanding to start off with. And there were some versions of the gospel that were put out that were shorter than others, namely Mark, but that had a lot more to do with the audience that was in mind and the situation of writing than it did what was known and what wasn't known. That is, Matthew wrote to the Hebrews, and the Hebrews, frankly, are typically much more okay with longer texts than the Greek or the Roman mindset. Mark, on the other hand, was written particularly for the Roman mindset, and so it was shorter. You have Luke, who goes back, and his emphasis was on detail. He wanted to go through and make an accurate account of everything, and so he's much more detail-oriented than the others are, and so it wound up being a very long gospel. And then you have John, and John's purpose in writing the gospel was to compare Christ's teaching with what the rabbinic Orthodox Judaism of the day was teaching. And so John highlights those instances that compare the two. And so each one, within a particular purpose, wrote in a particular way. That doesn't mean that there's necessarily this evolution of the religion. It's just simply different audiences that were in mind for particular ones, and that's why we use all four, is because together you get a broad sense of everything. You have all of the different classes of audience concerned. You have both what we're coming from with Matthew. You have a mindset that is outside of the traditional mindset with Mark. You have, kind of the more or less picky, what were the details, what happened, trying to give an accurate account of the historicity in Luke. And then you also have the question of how what were the differences between what Christ taught and what the Jews of his time taught. So you have the similarities in Matthew, the differences in John. You have a general, fairly simple plea in Mark to people who are outside of this set, and then also a plea to people in general in Luke that goes through and is a little bit more detail-oriented. And so between all of them, you address all the major audience types fairly well. And so, no, there isn't this evolution of the gospel as some people like to claim, and they say, there's really these proto-forms, and they call it Q and other things like this, which we have absolutely no evidence for, by the way. There has never been a manuscript discovered that shows any evidence of that. There have always just been the four gospels, and no question in the history about that, except what liberal critics like to put out there and say, what really happened was this, and we have absolutely no evidence for it, but this is how it was, because this is what we think. Now, so I want to make that clear. I'm definitely not a liberal New Testament critic. I'm much more on the conservative side of things, and the standards that a conservative New Testament critic has are much more robust, I would say. Not that necessarily everyone's going to agree with them, but there are good reasons that particular groups have for questioning parts of the New Testament. And there are some standards that textual critics will go through and apply to different texts to see if there's actually really a basis for correcting the text as we now have it. And there's lots of things that you would look for. The default is always going to be that what you have now is probably what you should have. And even if you have a difference in manuscripts in and of itself, that isn't enough evidence. Okay, just to say that this text has it and this one doesn't have it doesn't mean that the one that doesn't have it is automatically the original. Like I said, shorter doesn't always mean it comes first. So one thing that you would look forward to, what we'll call our first standard, is chronology. Can we actually put these variants that occur, these differences that occur, in a particular chronological order? And if you can do that, then you have a much better argument. You can say, all of the early manuscripts said this, and then the later ones changed it to something else. Then you could actually have a basis for saying, we probably shouldn't go with this later variant because it isn't original. And one phrase that we're going to use later on when I go through some of the main variants is OBEM. That's going to be the acronym, or OBEM, and it means omitted by early manuscripts, meaning it's the early manuscripts that don't have this, not the later ones. But still, in and of itself, the chronology really isn't enough to say anything definitively. Yes, some of the early manuscripts may omit it, but that might have simply been scribal errors. It might have just been because the scribe skipped a line and copied down the wrong line or something like that. So chronology in and of itself is starting to go towards support, but in and of itself it's not really complete. You would want to have more with it. Another thing that a textual critic, at least a good textual critic, is going to do is they're going to look for historicity. That is this a variant that was actually known historically, not just a variant that is the result of a scribe making a mistake, but is this a variant that was known in history and even accepted in history? That is, are there Christians who thought that this was really the way that the text should be? And then also, in the history, can we find a motivation for why people might have changed it, one way or another? And that's the thing about any text. There is no text out there that doesn't exist without some kind of a context. And so what a good textual critic does is they look for the context of a particular change and see if there actually was a historical motivation for it. And if there is no historical knowledge of it or historical motivation for it, you'd chalk it up to scribal error, and no one seems to have actually believed that, and it was just a scribal mistake. If you have Christians, though, that accept a variant that we don't accept now, and you can see where a particular group might be tempted to change something, and then you have a much stronger argument for saying that it was changed. But like I said, if you don't have that context for it, the default would be to say, a scribe messed up. It might have been one of the early scribes, but a scribe messed up. Another thing that a good textual critic is going to look for is movement. That is, if you have this particular variant that is at issue, one question that comes up is, where has it been put? If it's always been put in the same place when it does show up, that means that everyone understood where it was supposed to go, and really no question about that. And so that's good evidence that people knew where it was supposed to be. And if people know where it was supposed to be, it's probably authentic to the text, or at least it was a variant that couldn't have been placed somewhere else. But if it does float around throughout the text in different places, even in different books perhaps, then that is a pretty strong indication that people didn't know exactly where it went, and they were basically coming up with a place for it, which means that it is an addition. So movement is a pretty good indicator. Formation is another thing that you look for. Did the variant change over time? Did it start out as one thing, and then you can see a history in the manuscripts with that chronology on top of it where it morphed into something else? And if it's going through change, that's evidence that it probably wasn't original either, because it didn't have a fixed form. Another major one is dubiousness. A lot of the early scribes actually recorded several notes in the margins of their texts. Later scribes weren't as careful about this, but most of the early scribes would go through and they would mark off certain passages, and they would talk about them a little bit. And sometimes they would mark a particular passage as dubious, that they doubted its authenticity. Now, if they doubted its authenticity, why would they put it in there in the first place? Well, the reason for that is that Christian scribes tended to be conservative. That is, on the chance that it was actually authentic to the text, they're going to include it. But because there's a chance that it might not be authentic to the text, they're going to put marks on it and say, we don't really trust this one. This one isn't in all of the manuscripts that we have, that we're using to compile this new manuscript. And so this one has some doubt associated with it. And sometimes you'll even get little colophones, little notes on the side that actually talk about where the variant came from. And if you get those, it's really easy to trace, but a lot of them don't have colophones. But still, if a scribe is saying that they don't trust it, and these are the people who are working on the text and who have been entrusted with its care, that's pretty good evidence that there's something fishy going on here. Now, like I said, I'm fairly conservative, and so I'm not going to go with just one of these criteria or even two of them. For the text that I decided to talk about as being significantly at issue within the different translations that are out there, I decided to limit it only to the main ones that are fairly well known, and only those that meet at least 4 out of the 5 criteria. So very strong evidence against that is worth looking at. So let's get into that. So we're talking about the differences between translations. Some translations will have parts that others don't. What about the missing parts? A lot of people are fairly familiar with Matthew 6:13b. That is, this is the Lord's Prayer. And if you have one of the more traditional texts, like I said, King James, New King James, or I think it's even in the Matthew's Bible, Geneva Bible, a lot of the orderly ones, it'll add a little part at the end of 13. And it usually goes something like this, and it depends on translation a little bit, but it usually goes something like this. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Well, the first problem that we have with that as far as the manuscript evidence is concerned is obim. It's omitted by early manuscripts. So the early manuscripts don't attest to it. Now, like I said, that could just be scribal error, errors on the part of early scribes, so that in and of itself isn't definitive, but there is a chronology to it. Early ones don't have it, later ones do have it. Now, historicity is a little bit more major concern. Are there Christian church fathers who
omit it and seem to be just fine with its omission. Origen is one of them. He omits it. Now, Origen's still a little bit strange and whatnot as far as doctrine and theology is concerned, but he also was a very well-respected textual scholar in his day, and even today he still is. Theology and doctrine, not so much, but as far as what was in a text and what wasn't in a text, he's pretty reliable for that. And he omits the last part of verse 13 of Matthew chapter 6. Now, what would be the motive for adding this part on there? Frankly, it would be to make the Lord's Prayer a little bit more pious, a little bit more ostentatious, if you will, which is really ironic because it's a part of the Sermon on the Mount in which he says, don't pray for show, don't have showy prayers, don't have long rambling prayers that you think are going to be answered because of your many words. But at the same time, Christianity later on didn't always listen to the context that much, and so a motivation that would happen is to make things more pious and more officious and more religious, if you will. So that is a possible historical motivation. Now, movement. Movements includes this part being moved around, and since it's at the end of the Lord's Prayer, you're not going to find that. But a question that can come up is, was this moved from somewhere? And early Christians more often used the Septuagint than they did other forms of the Old Testament text. And it's interesting, in 1 Chronicles 29:11 through 13, there's a prayer that David gives, and he puts words in it that are actually very, very, very similar to Matthew 6:13, part B, the second part of verse 13. And it's very, very, very similar. So it's possible that a scribe decided to blend those two prayers, and transferring from one testament to the other was actually something that did happen from time to time in the early manuscripts. So that may have simply been an error, or it may have been something that was intentionally done to make the Lord's Prayer a little bit more ostentatious. Now, what's interesting is that when the Lord's Prayer is recorded in Luke, it doesn't have this last little bit on it, and so it is quite possible that it wasn't there in the first place, just because the two people who recorded it in the early manuscripts, neither of them have it, and in the later ones, Luke still doesn't have it. But formation is another thing. Did this change over time? And the answer is yes. There's actually 4 different long endings for the Lord's Prayer. They're all very close to 1 Corinthians 29:11 through 13, but there are some variations within them. And so it wasn't dead set. It wasn't something that was certain. Now, was it ever marked dubious? Not to my knowledge. There were no scribes who marked it as dubious that I'm aware of. But like I said, that means at least 4 out of the 5. And like I said, I'm not going to put any out there that aren't at least 4 out of the 5. So is there a reason to doubt that Matthew 6:13b was a part of the original text? Yes. But like I said, that's not necessarily going to be convincing for people. But for those serious Christians who are not going off into liberal land, there actually are some significant reasons why you would doubt that the long ending of the Lord's Prayer was actually authentic. The long ending of Mark is probably a more famous one. It is omitted by early manuscripts. Not many of them, though. There's like 3, I think it is. Both Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and then there's, I think, a Syriac manuscript that also omits the long ending. So not a ton. Not a ton. But there are some church fathers who omit it. Eusebius is pretty important because Eusebius put together kind of an interconnected a table that showed the interconnections between the Gospels, and he completely omitted the last part of Mark 16 from that table. He doesn't seem to be aware of it at all. And then for historical motive, so we have someone in history who doesn't seem to be aware of this part that is possibly an addition. And for a motive, the simple motive would be that you'd want to complete the Gospel of Mark, because if you leave the Gospel of Mark at 6:8, it kind of leaves it in kind of an awkward spot. You still have a lot of the Christian fundamental teachings there. You still have the deity of Christ. You still have the resurrection. You still have the death and all that. But it doesn't, tell the rest of the story. The rest of the story you'd have to go to in like Acts or one of the other Gospels. And so that kind of would be a bit of something that would be a little produce some angst, is maybe a good way of putting it, in the Christians, and so they'd want to flush out the count and fill it out. Now, as far as movement is concerned, there's no movement that happens with the long ending of Mark. The ending of Mark is always at the ending of Mark, so you don't really expect a lot of movement to happen. Anyway, so that one, it fails that criteria. But like I said, I'm looking for 4 out of 5, so the fact that movement doesn't occur in and of itself isn't an exclusion from my list here. Formation. There is evidence of formation. There is a short ending that was sometimes placed between verse 8 and verse 9 that was basically said, what some of the early manuscripts basically said is, here is the long ending that we're putting forward, but here's kind of the original ending. And they would put it right after verse 8, and it's a much shorter ending. It's basically just one verse. And then also, between verses 14 and 15, some of the manuscripts will put in what is called the Freer Logion. And it's a weird little insertion that occurs in some of them and not in others. And it seems to indicate that the form of the long ending hadn't been settled, whether we should include this one little part here, whether we should make mention of this other ending here. It was up for debate. Now, do scribes ever mark it as dubious? Yes. In fact, Family 1, all of Family 1 marks the long ending of Mark as dubious. And also there are little notes in some of them that will say who actually wrote the long ending, and it wasn't Mark, it was a fellow by the name of Aristion. And that is probably the most damaging evidence for the long ending of Mark. The fact that it was omitted by a few early manuscripts in and of itself isn't super compelling. The fact that Eusebius omits it, and that, you can kind of imagine why Christians would want to add an ending to it, that in and of itself, not quite as convincing as it could be. The fact that there are different forms that existed, that they were toying around with different endings for it, that is more compelling. But I think personally for me, what produces why I would say I wouldn't necessarily trust the long ending of Mark is because early Christians said very specifically that it wasn't written by Mark, that it was written by Aristion. So is it being a part of the Gospel of Mark? No. Now, if you wanted to change the name to the Gospel of Mark and Aristion, maybe we could go with that. But no, it does not seem to have actually been original to Mark's writing. Luke 22:43 through 44. This is where Jesus sweats drops of blood and is then attended by angels in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is a very interesting passage. First of all, it is omitted by early manuscripts. So there's a bit of evidence against it on that one. Jerome knows of the difference between them. He says that there are some manuscripts that he has available to him that have it, and some that don't have it. And what would be the motive for this? Why did they actually have a reason for changing the Gospel of Luke to include this? And if they did have a motive, it would probably have to do with Docetism. Docetism was a belief that Christ was God and not man, that he only appeared human, and that he only appeared to suffer. So if we put in this section in Luke that says that, he sweat drops of blood, well, obviously he's suffering, and he's truly suffering, and this could be a good anti-docetic verse. And so that would be the motivation behind it, and it does seem to be a very early addition that roughly coincides with the time of Docetism. But still, 2 out of 5, not as compelling as it could be, so let's move on. Movement. Actually, all of Family 13, an entire family of manuscripts, doesn't put it in Luke. Instead, they put it in Matthew. In Matthew 26:39. Right after Matthew 26:39, they put this section. And that would be evidence that some scribes didn't seem to know where it went. Basically the exact same passage, but some of them put it in Matthew, some of them put it in Luke, and the ones who put it in Luke basically won out. That was the form of the text that became most popular. Now, why, if it was original to Luke, why would they suddenly put it in Matthew? Now, there's not really a super good reason for that I can think of, other than you just have a completely idiotic scribe, and you have a completely idiotic set of scribes for an entire family of manuscripts. Now, if it was something that was added, then you could understand why scribes would disagree about it. They say, where is the best place to put this? And some will say, well, we should put it in Matthew because that's the first gospel. No, we should put it in Luke because that's the one that, that deals with the detailed stuff, and the one that was written by the doctor who's going to notice this medical stuff. And the argument that, we should put it with Luke because he's the doctor, that one seems to be the one that won out. But there were some people that seem to be arguing that it should go in Matthew. Formation. Does the form of the text actually change? And the answer is yes. There's 3 different variants of it that you can find in different manuscripts. 3 little changes within the text that would seem to indicate that it was in a process of formation that hadn't been fixed from the beginning. And then, is it ever marked dubious? Yes, there are multiple manuscripts that mark this section as dubious. So it actually meets all 5 of the criteria for being something that we could doubt. Now, most of your translations that are out there actually won't take this part out, just because it's one of the oldest variants that are out there. It is well known even to people in the 2nd century. So Irenaeus, for example, does talk about it. But there are obviously Christian groups that didn't have access to it, such that by the time of Jerome, you still have manuscripts that don't have it in it, that don't have this variant in them. So it's definitely a part of traditional Christianity, at the least. It might not have always been in the manuscripts, but it's definitely traditional. And a lot of the parts that translations keep, they keep on the basis of tradition, not necessarily on the basis of. All right, so those are 3. Let's talk about another 3. This one actually I talked about at the beginning of this, John chapter 5. And then the last part of verse 3 and basically all of verse 4 is a fairly famous one. And a lot of people who talk about New Testament variants, they'll do this. They'll say, does anyone in the congregation, have an NIV or something like that? And get a few people to say, okay, do you have an NIV? Okay, could you just find and read for us John 5:4? Could you do that? And they'll sit there and they'll wait. And of course, if you have the NIV, you're not going to find it because it's not in the text. It's in a footnote down at the bottom. And the reason for that is that the NIV Translation Committee said that there was enough evidence against this particular verse that they were convinced that it wasn't original to John. And some of the evidence is what we're going to go over now. As to chronology, again, it's omitted by early manuscripts. In and of itself, not necessarily compelling, but at least there's a basis for saying that there's at least possibly a difference here. Still, at this point, might be a scribal error, but early ones don't have it, later ones do have it. Historicity. Cyril omits this verse when he's talking about this John chapter 5, when he's talking about the pool of Bethsaida. Cyril completely omits this section. He doesn't have access to it, and that's the 4th century. So you have Christians even in the 4th century who are not aware of this section. What would be the motive? The simple motive would be to explain the pool of Bethsaida. This is the section that talks about the angel coming and stirring the waters and that. And, this is the reason why people were gathered around the pool of Bethsaida and all this. And it's, as likely an explanation as any, I guess. I mean, when you have a supernatural event occur, you're going to come up with a supernatural explanation. And so, it's, in a basic sense, as plausible as any other. And people definitely would have wanted to have some kind of an answer for it. And so, if it is something that is a change, the motivation for it would have been to explain what was happening with the pool of Bethsaida and why people were waiting around it. Now, movements, you wouldn't expect movement on this one, and there isn't any evidence of movement of this section being moved around. Because this section is there to explain what's going on with the pool of Bethsaida and the angel stirring the waters and all this. So yeah, it's not going to be put anywhere else. So yeah, there's no movement on this one. But formation. There is evidence of formation. You find some manuscripts that, of course, don't have any, either 3b or 4. And then you also have some manuscripts that have just 3b, and you'll have some that just have 4. And then as time goes on, they get merged into the same manuscripts, and then those manuscripts go forward. So there is evidence of formation there. That it seems to be that originally you didn't have either of them. Then independently, you had some manuscripts putting in 3b and some of them putting in 4, and then eventually those two variants getting merged together. And was this part ever marked as being dubious by the scribes? Yes, there are multiple manuscripts, multiple independent manuscripts, not a family or one is taken from the other, but independent manuscripts that say that this part isn't original. So, like I said, that meets the 4 out of the 5, and it was strong enough evidence that both the NIV, ESV, and some of the other translations decided to omit it, that they were said that this is strong enough evidence, and that the evidence comes late enough that we can be very sure that this was an original. That didn't happen with Jesus sweating blood, because there are some Christians who do cite it fairly early on, and so it's a little bit harder with those ones to say, but with this one, you've got people clear into the 4th century who are still omitting it, so it doesn't really seem to be original. Another fairly famous one is John chapter 7, verse 53 through 8, verse 11. This is the story of the woman caught in adultery. This one is omitted by a lot of the early manuscripts, which, like I said, in and of itself isn't necessarily conclusive, but it does add some chronology here. Historicity. Chrysostom omits this. He actually does a homilies, basically sermons, on the book of John, and I've actually read a great number of them, and he does. He completely skips over this section when he gets to the end of chapter 7, and he goes right on to chapter 8, verse 12. He doesn't seem to have any awareness of this variant at all. Now, what would be the motive for putting in the woman caught in adultery? On one hand, it seems to be very anti-Jewish for the understanding that the Jews had at the time, and their understanding of the law at the time, because Jesus in this story really goes against that. It is very, very different, very distinct. It separates Christianity from Judaism in a very big way. And Christianity and Judaism really had to develop their own identities. In the 1st century, there was a lot of confusion between the two as to which was what, and then in later centuries they drifted further and further apart. And so this may have been added to more so carefully delineate the differences between the two religions. That is, that the Jews followed the letter of the law, Christians followed the heart of the law, and that kind of being the overall implication of, the woman caught in adultery, that Christians understood that they were sinners saved by grace, and that the law should be lived out in love and in keeping with the heart of the law, not necessarily the letter of the law. And it characterizes the Jews as ritualistic, legalistic kind of people. Another possible motive is that it may have simply been to include parts that came from the oral tradition. That is, if you read parts from the canons of the apostles and other parts that were supposedly compiled from the oral tradition of the apostles, you'll find references to a woman that was caught in adultery. And they're very fleeting references. They're definitely not as full as you find in the book of John. But these parts of oral tradition, the Christians may have flushed out and said, this is a good enough story, we want to include it in the Bible, and so they put it in. And in my own study of it, I didn't find actually any Christian author referencing it as being a part of the book of John until the 5th century. And that's quite a ways down the line. So it's very possible that one of those two motives was at place there, or perhaps both. Movement. There's lots of a movement that occurs with the woman caught in adultery. It was placed in different places in chapter 7 of John. It was also placed in John chapter 21, which is very odd because that's the end of the book. It was also placed in Luke, and in 2 different places in Luke, in chapter 21 and in chapter 24, which is really, really strange. That there's so much movement, both within the book of John itself and in an entirely different book. They couldn't even decide, it seems, the scribes couldn't decide on which book it belonged in, which would be the best fit here. Eventually they seem to agree on the book of John, because the book of John is the one that deals most specifically with how Christ's teachings compared with the Judaism of his day, and so that one seemed to be the best fit. But there also could be the argument for, we should put this in Luke because Luke is the more detail-oriented guy. And so you can see where the scribes would kind of argue about where we should put this. And so it does seem to be something that wasn't original in that sense. Formation, is there evidence that it went through different forms? And the answer is yes. If you look at the different stories that are recorded from the teachings of the apostles, there's different variants there. And then within the manuscript history itself, there's of course some that omit it. And then there are also some that only include parts. There's some of them that will include 753 through 82, which doesn't actually get right into the woman caught into adultery yet. It's kind of a transitionary statement. And then those that include just 8:3 through 11 that is more specific about the woman caught in adultery. And these two different forms seem to exist separately and eventually were merged, a lot like John chapter 5, 3b, and 4. Now, is it ever marked as dubious? Yes, in 2 manuscripts. Not as many as some of the others, but in 2 manuscripts there are scribes who said, yeah, we're not sure that this is actually authentic. And so, for the woman caught in adultery, it matches every single criteria. The chronology is off in that the early ones don't seem to have it. The historicity is off in that there are early church fathers and even later church fathers who omit it. There is a plausible historical motive for adding it, and there is movement, that is, there is evidence that they didn't know where it went, and so they toyed around with different places. There's also evidence of formation, that it existed in different forms before they finally finalized it. And there were also scribes who had problems with it, who said, yeah, we're not really sure that this is actually truly what John wrote. And so it matches every single criteria. So a lot of evangelical preachers today do not regularly preach from the woman caught in adultery anymore, and it's because it doesn't seem to be authentic. It's definitely a part of traditional Christianity from after the 4th century. But as far as it being a part of original Christianity, we don't really have good evidence of that. And so while it's included in a lot of the translations for the sake of tradition, it is fast becoming something that people don't preach from anymore, just because they can't be sure that it's actually original. And all the evidence seems to be to the contrary. Another one that is a little bit more lighthearted, I would say, is 1 John 5, 7b and 8. Last part of verse 7 and most of chapter 8. And this is the one that talks about the 3 who testify in heaven. And what's interesting about it is it's omitted by pretty much all early manuscripts. And in fact, the first place where you'll find it in the manuscript history is actually in the Latin, and not in the Greek. It doesn't seem to show up in the Greek until towards the turn of the millennium. And even in the Latin, it doesn't show up very early. It's like 7th century that shows up in the Latin. So, very late addition. And when you talk about historicity, pretty much all of the church fathers omit it. There is no early church father who actually talks about 1 John 5, 7, and 8. There is no, and by the way, this is called the Comma Johanneum. There's no one who, in the early church fathers, who mentioned this. It's unknown to all of them. And what is the motive here? Well, it seems to be very strongly pro-Trinitarian. You want to prove the Trinity from the Bible, and so you put in this verse that says, there's these 3 in heaven, that they agree in one, and has very strongly Trinitarian overtones on it. Now, is there any movement that's associated with it? No, because this is really kind of the only place in the Bible where you could really fit this, and especially within 1 John that you could fit this. So you really wouldn't expect movement. What about formation? There are, of course, the Latin form, but there's also a couple of different Greek forms for it. Like I said, it seemed to travel from the Latin into the Greek, and when it traveled into the Greek, it was transferred in a couple of different forms, which is something that you would understand with translation. No 2 translators are going to choose to translate things exactly the same. And so there seems to be 2 different lines of transmission on how it got into the Greek, and they disagree with each other. They don't translate the Latin exactly the same. but they do seem to be translations from Latin into Greek, and they are different. And then, is there anyone who marks it as dubious? Yes, Erasmus and Tyndale both mark it as dubious, and if you know these guys, you know that they're actually quite late in the game. These are Reformation-era people, and they are still finding manuscripts that don't have it, and then finding later ones that are put out, especially by the Western Church, because this is a Western variant, that say, no, you should really have this in there. And Erasmus actually felt that he was deceived on the matter. In one of his editions, he put in the comma Johannem, he put in this long part, but he also put in a footnote on it that said, explaining why he didn't think that this was original to the text. And so Tyndale, who's translating from Erasmus, he looks at some of Erasmus's editions that don't have it and some of them that do, and his solution when he translates it into English is to put it in parentheses in English saying, this might not be original to the text. And so this is a very late variant that the vast majority of Greek-speaking and Greek-reading Christians wouldn't have been aware of, possibly clear up into the 1400s for some of them. Certainly not until around the time of the turn of the millennium for most of them. And so very late edition, and very unequivocally a very late edition. And a lot of Bible translations will omit this, and they won't even give a footnote on it, some of them. And there's also a lot of critical editions that are out there that don't mention this one at all just because it is such a late edition that people don't really even bother with it anymore. It's kind of interesting. Alright, so what's the effect? There are obviously some very significant variants in the New Testament text. I mean, you're talking about sections that have quite a few verses in them, like 12 verses at a time. That's a pretty good size. What's the net effect of having them in there versus not having them in there? Well, as far as evangelicalism is concerned, it actually doesn't really have an appreciable effect. It doesn't change any fundamental theology. That is, you could still argue for the Trinity without the comma Johannium, and in fact, Christians have been arguing for the Trinity from Scripture without the comma Johannium for literally about 2,000 years, and they've been doing just fine. It also doesn't change any core doctrines for most of evangelicalism as a whole. Now, it would affect some fundamentalist groups, particularly those around the Ozarks who like to handle snakes and drink poison, because that's what the long ending of Mark talks about. But for evangelicalism as a whole, no, it doesn't really affect them much. And even these variants really wouldn't have a significant effect on traditional practice either, except that removing them is a direct attestation against tradition, and that it says that tradition added things that were not appropriate to add, and that tradition got it wrong. And so when traditional Christians go against the more modern translations that do take this out, it's not because it affects theology or doctrine for them, so much as it goes against tradition. And that basically becomes the crux of their theology and doctrine, as that we transmitted it right. Their emphasis is very much so on the church, not on the text. And so an attack on the text in that way, to say that, these are these parts that came down through tradition that weren't actually accurate to what the original said, they see that as being an attack on the church, not necessarily an attack on doctrine or theology, but they see it usually as being an attack on the church and saying that the church didn't get everything right. Well, that's what evangelicals believe. We don't believe that the church gets everything right, and even nowadays, even within evangelical churches, we don't believe that we always get it right. Like I said, fundamental tenet of evangelical thought is that humans are fallible, which means that human institutions, even if set up by God or with godly intent, can still be corrupted. And as a result of that, we don't emphasize the church as an institution. As a church, as a body of believers that is there to edify and build each other up, yes, we do. As an institution that has salvational value or a fullness of the gospel, no. And with all the evidence that we have out there from all the church fathers, and there's tons of evidence from the church fathers, and all the manuscript evidence for the New Testament, we have over 5,500 manuscripts. We've got more than we'll ever need. With all of this evidence compiled, the critical New Testament text that we have nowadays has a confidence rating of about 99.5. The Old Testament, there's a little bit more variation there because it's older. We only have about 98% confidence in, which is still more than any other book in antiquity. That's not an issue. I mean, you can talk about other ancient books like, say, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, and their confidence ratings usually are only 95%, so we're still well above everything else. But we're still very confident based on all the evidence that we have for saying what was originally there and what wasn't originally there. And the major publications that are out there for the Greek are basically virtually identical. The UBS-5 and the NA-28 are the main ones that are out there that are used for Bible translation. The UBS-5 is the United Bible Society's 5th edition, and it will be coming out this summer. And its text, its base text, is actually going to be exactly the same as the Nestle Aland 28th edition. I actually have a copy of the Nestle Aland 28th. And they're going to be the same base text. They're going to differ on some issues of punctuation and some paragraphing. But both groups are looking at it and saying, we have such strong evidence here that we really are convinced that this is the way the New Testament is supposed to be, at least within, a 0.5% error margin. And they come out to the conclusion that it's basically the exact same text. And so that's what they use. This is what it is, and for the majority of critical scholars and even traditional conservative scholars, they agree, this is what it is. So most of the differences in translations that you get actually doesn't really have a lot to do with the Greek itself. What was there originally in the Greek is pretty well understood. Most of the differences are due to more so to tradition and differences in what the translators decided to do rather than the original. Most of the differences are due to translation. That is, the older translations like the King James and Geneva and those ones were translated from relatively small pools of manuscripts. The King James, for example, was based off of about 7 printed editions. 5 from Erasmus, 1 from Beza, and 1 from Stephanos. And of course they didn't have all of the other text available to them to make these decisions on. And so it's textually limited. They were just going with what they had best evidence for at the time. And so that's why the King James and some of these other older ones wind up being so different from some of the modern ones. The modern ones have a lot more textual evidence that goes into them. Like I said, right now we're 5,500 manuscripts plus. Back in the days of the King James translation, 7 printed editions. That's huge difference there. But even for that, there's, like I said, no significant differences in theology or doctrine for evangelicals. It doesn't really affect that. And like I said, right now, as far as what is original and what isn't, there's pretty much universal consent as to what it was and what it isn't. There are still people who argue in favor of what's called the majority text or the Byzantine text, basically the traditional text. But they're definitely a very distinct minority, and they actually a lot of times don't actually go with a majority text or a true Byzantine text. A lot of times they just go with their traditional King James text, and they don't realize that they're actually different. The King James text actually differs from the majority text in about 1,800 places. It's not the same. And they like to ignore that. But they keep trying to argue for the authenticity of the King James above all others, and this is kind of part of the King James only movement. And they say, well, the King James uses the traditional text, the majority text, and that's what we should go with. Well, it's not really majority text if you're only based on 7 manuscripts. But that's probably a discussion best left for another time. The point that I'm trying to make here is that as far as theology and doctrine are concerned, it doesn't really affect anyone. It doesn't really affect the evangelicals. It doesn't affect the traditional Christians, Protestantism in general, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy. As far as doctrine and theology is concerned, it doesn't really affect anyone at all. It does kind of hurt the pride of the traditional churches a little bit in that it says, you guys got things wrong. And it does affect some people in the evangelical churches because they're used to reading out of their King James. And when they spot differences, it kind of irks them, understandably so. But like I said, no real significant points are different there. And in the modern text that we now have, you can have a great deal of confidence, 99.5. That's pretty good. I'm a high school math teacher, and if I could get students to have a 99.5%, that pretty much means they know exactly, as much of the material as I know. Because I admit that I would probably make one mistake in 200. I mean, if I can get a student that is able to keep it at one mistake in 200 or less, that's pretty good. I'd be pretty happy with that. Moving on. So again, how do evangelicals know that it's canonical? Like I said, this is very similar to the Old Testament. How do we know it's canonical? Well, when you take all of this evidence, you compile it, you consolidate it down, and what you wind up getting out of it is the three basic principles that evangelicals have in general. First is person. Now, in the Old Testament, the person you were required to have writing the scripture was a prophet. In the New Testament, it's a witness of Christ. In particular, we say an eye or an ear witness of Christ. And this is actually old phrasing that we're borrowing from the early church fathers. That is, an eyewitness is someone who actually saw it happen. So they're a first-hand witness of what happened. Or an ear witness. An ear witness is someone who heard from an eyewitness. Now, why do we say first witness or second witness, but we don't go any further? Well, this is the same understanding that the early church fathers had with it. Is that if you take it any further than that, you're basically getting on to hearsay at that point. You're basically saying, I heard from a guy who heard from a guy who heard from a guy. At that point, it just becomes an urban myth. And Christianity isn't an urban myth. It is historically real events. Christ is, in fact, truly God in the flesh who came down as a literal man. That is the Christian affirmation. And because of that, what we're going to choose to represent it is something that meets historical legal criteria. So in a legal case, you can't have hearsay entered into evidence. It has to be from a first or second witness, either someone who saw it happen or someone who talked to someone who saw it happen. You get any further than that, it's just hearsay. So when we're talking about the New Testament text, it has to be an eyewitness or an ear witness. Let's talk about the authors a little bit. Eyewitnesses. Matthew, he was one of the disciples of Christ. He was an eyewitness. John, also a disciple of Christ, also an eyewitness. Now, Paul is a little bit... people make arguments about Paul one way or the other. He's still going to be in the category of a first or second witness, but people argue about which one it should be. Because Paul did have the road to Damascus experience there where he did see Christ, but he didn't see Christ's ministry. He wasn't a part of Christ's ministry from the beginning. So he did see Christ, but he wasn't with Christ for his ministry, if that makes sense. And so some people say he should be an eyewitness, some people say he should be an ear witness, and that's why he occurs in both lists here. Okay, and where you come out on that is eventually up to you, but he is definitely accepted as being one of the two categories. James, the brother of Christ, he definitely knew Christ, all along the line. He's definitely an eyewitness. Peter, again, disciple of Christ, was there from the beginning of the ministry. Eyewitness. Jude, also another brother of Christ, and definitely an eyewitness. So those are the eyewitnesses, and then you have the ear witnesses, the people who heard from the people who are eyewitnesses. You have Mark, and Mark basically wrote down Peter's account. And so the Gospel of Mark, in a lot of ways, is the Gospel of Peter as recorded by Mark. And so that's interesting. When you're reading Mark's Gospel, remember, keep that in mind. All of the church fathers were pretty much unanimous on that Mark was actually writing based on what Peter said. And so what you're really, in a lot of ways, reading is you're reading the Gospel according to Peter. And that's also why the supposed Gospel of Peter that showed up that was Gnostic was rejected, is because we already have the Gospel of Peter. It's the one that was recorded by Mark. And so the early Christians could reject that pretty easily because they said, no, Peter didn't write through someone else. It didn't write his own gospel. Instead, he had Mark write for him. And this makes sense with who Peter is. Peter is a fisherman. He's not exactly the best educated person in the world. And so it doesn't actually make sense that he would write his own gospel. Instead, he would have somebody else write it for him, and that person being Mark. And then there's also Luke. Some people put Luke as a part of the 70 that went out, obviously not a part of the 12, but he may have been influential in Christ's early ministry, but we certainly see him later, if nothing else. He is definitely a companion of Paul in the book of Acts, and Luke is mentioned by Paul in Paul's letters, and so he's definitely a close associate of Paul at the very least. And he does have interactions with a lot of the other apostles. He does have interactions with Peter, with the brothers of Christ, and the other early apostles. So he, at least in the book of Acts, we have him interacting with the other apostles who definitely were there. So even if we don't have the association with Paul, we definitely have him associated with the other apostles. So he definitely still qualifies as an ear witness. And like I said, some people argue about Paul. Like you said, he did see Christ on the road to Damascus, but he wasn't there for all of Christ's ministry. So there's debate about whether he should be an eye or an ear witness. And then I'm throwing this in there just because there is dispute about it, and that is the author of Hebrews. Now, like I said, if you go with all of the early testimony, there's a lot of universal agreement that Hebrews was written by Paul in a lot of sense. The only ones who doubt that are those who are influenced by Montanism, and Montanism led to, concerns regarding Hebrews. So that's that. Second criteria that we'd have for it being canonical. Not only does it have to be written by the right person, which leads out like pretty much all of the Gnostic writings. Gospel of Thomas, all of them, they're pretty much weeded out on that part. We don't have any evidence that they're actually written by the people that they claim to be written by. And that also has to do with authenticity, but has to be written by one of these people that are listed up here. But going back just to the author of Hebrews for a second, like I said, there's good evidence for it being Paul, but even if it wasn't, when you look at the end of Hebrews and the people that it mentions, you can definitely see that they were in Paul's group, in Luke's group. These were people who are obviously very closely associated with the apostles themselves, the eyewitnesses, and so whoever the author of Hebrews was would definitely qualify at least as an ear witness. But going on to the next one. Agreement with established Scripture. So we have these New Testament works, and we're going, because we're evangelicals and we worry about truth, we're going to look for consistency. These things that they're writing about, is this consistent with what God said would happen in the Old Testament? And we've already talked about our standards for the Old Testament before in the 39 books that evangelicals accept. And so for the New Testament works, we only accept those that coincide with the 39 Old Testament books. And if there's a disagreement between them, we're going to leave off the New Testament work that doesn't match up because we've already established our criteria for the Old Testament. And then authenticity. If we're going to include it in the New Testament canon, it cannot be historically proven to be inaccurate or spurious, and it has to be well supported within the historical record. This is virtually identical, and it is basically identical to the Old Testament standard that we put here. It has to be authentic. It can't be something that's spurious. It can't be something that's inaccurate. Like I said, the Gospel of Thomas, or I can't remember which one it was, but I think it was the Gospel of Thomas, said that the Sea of Galilee wasn't in Israel. That's obviously a glaring hole right there that says this person has absolutely no clue what they're talking about. So no, we're not going to trust them. And we also expect it to be in the historical record from an early time. For example, the Canon of the Apostles, you don't see people listing it as a canonical work until the first ones that I think mention it at all are somewhere around the 4th century, and they mention it in a negative light. It doesn't get mentioned in a positive light until you get to John of Damascus in the 7th and 8th century. So it's not well supported in the historical record, and certainly is not something you could argue being there from the beginning. And so we would definitely argue against it. And so putting all of these three criteria together, you get the basis for the New Testament canon that we have. And it's proven very reliable. These three basic standards, the person, agreement with established Scripture, and authenticity, have proven very effective for checking both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And you can find a great deal of agreement with these standards and with what the early church fathers came up with. Not necessarily what they eventually changed things to, but the first ones to comment on seem to be in agreement on these standards. So that rounds out the discussion of the New Testament canon. Lots of material, I know. If you stuck around through it, thanks for indulging me. I hope you guys learned some stuff. And overall, I hope you had fun, because the New Testament, as Christians, really should excite us. I mean, we have the witness accounts of what happened with Christ, eye and ear witnesses talking about these things. It's exciting in so many ways, amazing, and it's nice to know that we can actually have a great deal of confidence about it. I mean, all the way from First Clement in the first century, who mentions or makes reference to books from every category of the New Testament, the Gospels, Acts, the Pauline epistles, the Catholic epistles, and Revelation, all of them being referenced, all of those sections being referenced in the first century on down the line. And yeah, there are definitely some disputes that came up, and the influence of Gnosticism and Montanism kind of threw some wrinkles into it, and then there's some general considerations, just that happened as a result of geographic isolation and persecution and things like that. But overall, you get a very clear picture. And yeah, like I said, some disputes, but you don't have to rest on any one witness. You can compile it all and get a very good sense of what was going on. And so I hope that this increases your confidence in the New Testament and brings out the different issues. And I would definitely say pay especially careful attention to the quote from Athanasius that I brought up, that when we're talking about canonical scripture, the main purpose is so that we can know when we've fallen into error and whatnot. And when we fall into error, the response that we are to have as Christians, staying true to that historical model that Athanasius put forward, is to confront the people that led us into error and say, no, this is wrong. I love you as and I realize that you affirm the historicity of Christ and his saving work on the cross and whatnot, or perhaps they don't even do that. But in love, look at them and say, I really think you got it wrong. And the reason why I think you got it wrong is because what you're saying just doesn't match up with Scripture. That's the standard that was put forward by the early church fathers, and that's the standard that we affirm. I want you guys to have confidence in that. We didn't create something that was new. This is something that was there, well established, and continued. It wasn't just something that happened in the first century. There were people in other centuries that made the same kind of statements. What evangelicalism does on its core level actually is very well founded, and I want you guys to understand that. You don't have to go to traditional Christianity, because a lot of what we do is represented by traditional Christianity. It's where we got the ideas from. The Reformation didn't come out of nowhere. Most of the Reformation thinkers knew a lot of what the early church fathers had said, and they actually brought up the early church fathers sometimes. Not super often, not as often as they could have, but they were definitely aware of it, and that was part of their basis for the accusations that they brought against the traditional churches. And like I said, the accusations don't necessarily have to be belligerent necessarily, but I think we do have a responsibility to state what the differences are, and to be honest and open about our concerns. And that's what I've tried to do here. I do have traditional friends, and I love them dearly, but yes, there are some things that I disagree with them on, and I'm not afraid to disagree with them on these things. And I hope that any of my traditional friends who listen to this understand that I'm not attacking them as individuals here, but what I'm saying is that there are things in their belief system that, first of all, don't match up with historic Christianity as delivered from the beginning, and also don't match up with Scripture. And that greatly concerns me, because if you're not a part of historic Christianity and you're not in line with Scripture, as per what Basil and others said, that means you're out of the faith, and I don't want you to be out of the faith. I'm greatly concerned over that. And that is a large part of my reason in putting forward these presentations on the canon, is that I want people to understand what my concerns are. You probably won't agree with them, but I at least want you to understand them. So thank you very much for listening. I know it's been a long time. I greatly thank you for that. And God bless you, and may you have a wonderful day. Thank you.